The Nile does not rush. It does not stumble or crash. It flows like a breath stretched across eternity, carrying silt, fish, reeds, and the dreams of a people who built their lives on its banks. Every year, it swells with the flood, drowning the land, only to leave behind the black earth that feeds the villages. And every year, families wait by its edge, watching the waters creep higher, wondering if this season it will be too much or too little. For them, the river is not just water. It is the line between hunger and survival, between despair and abundance. In the pale light of dawn, when the air is still cool, farmers walk barefoot along the damp soil. Their hands are rough, their bodies lean from work, yet there is rhythm in their steps. They know the cycle, sowing after the flood, tending the fields as the earth hardens, reaping before the sun burns too fiercely. Children carry baskets of seed, scattering them in wide arcs. Men press the earth flat with wooden hoes, pulling the soil closed with the steady weight of their shoulders. Women bring jars of water, gathered from the canals that stretched like veins into the fields. All of it moves together, like a single body feeding itself. The sound is not of machines, not of shouting, but of hands and earth, of sandals brushing against the mud. The land has its own music, and every family is part of its choir. By midday, the sun presses down like a god testing their strength. Shade is rare, found only beneath a palm or the mud brick walls of their homes. The houses are small, made from clay shaped by hand, baked by the same sun that beats upon them. Inside, mats woven from reeds lie on the ground. Jars of grain sit stacked against the walls, and the smell of dried fish lingers in the air. Life is simple, but never idle. Women grind grain on heavy stones, leaning into the motion with arms strong from repetition. The sound of stone against stone is as constant as the river itself. Bread is baked in clay ovens, the flat loaves feeding the household alongside onions, beans, and whatever fish the men pulled from the river that morning. There is little waste, even. The reeds along the Nile are gathered, twisted into ropes or woven into mats that cushion their sleep. In the evenings, when the day's labor is done, families gather outside their homes. Children play with carved wooden toys or chase one another in the dust, their laughter cutting through the hum of insects. Men sit together, sharing stories, sharpening tools, or simply watching the sky darken. Women braid each other's hair, sing softly to their children, or mend clothes by the fading light. And above it all, the river glimmers, a ribbon of silver reflecting the first touch of the moon. For the villagers, time does not run fast. It is measured by floods and harvests, births and funerals. The past is not something lost, but something carried, like the scar of a cut long healed. A father remembers his father's hands guiding him in the fields, just as he now guides his own son. A mother recalls the lullabies whispered to her when she was small, the same words now sung into the ears of her daughters. But memory flows through them, just as the Nile flows through their land. At night, the world slows further. Oil lamps flicker inside mud brick homes, their flames trembling against walls stained with smoke. Outside, jackals howl at the edges of the fields, and the air smells of earth cooling after the day's heat. Families curl together on mats, covering themselves with linen cloths. The darkness is not feared. It is simply another face of the day. Sleep comes like the river, steady, unhurried, and essential. Yet dreams are never simple. To the people of this land, sleep is a step into another world, one ruled by gods who may whisper warnings or blessings. The child wakes crying from a vision of a crocodile, and the mother murmurs that Sobek, the river god, has simply reminded them to respect his waters. A man dreams of falcons soaring above, and in the morning he walks taller, believing Horus himself has blessed him. Every dream is a message, every shadow a presence, Every star, a reminder that life is woven with threads beyond what the eyes can see. The villagers know they are watched, judged, guided. Their offerings are small bread left at a shrine, a handful of beer poured into the dust, a flower laid before a painted image. Yet to them, these gestures are not empty. They are a way of speaking to the unseen, of acknowledging that their lives are only part of a greater design. Would you have trusted so completely in signs and dreams? Would you have felt comforted by the gods, or restless under their gaze? The Nile gives, and the Nile takes, and always it returns. The villagers do not need to understand its mysteries. They only need to live within them. Their days stretch like the river itself, quiet, flowing, eternal. Stone is heavier than words can ever express. To move it, to cut it, to shape it into monuments that scrape the sky, takes not only strength, but patience that borders on reverence. Along the Nile, in dusty quarries, where the air hangs thick with the taste of grit, men strike at rock with copper chisels. The sound is sharp, constant, echoing off the cliffs like a heartbeat of the earth itself. Dust clings to their skin, filling their mouths, scratching their throats. Still, they swing. Each strike breaks away only a small piece, yet thousands upon thousands of such fragments form the bones of pyramids. The work is endless, but so too is the determination. Blocks of limestone, some as heavy as oxen, are dragged on sledges across planks soaked in water to ease the friction. Teams of men strain against the ropes, their bodies bent like bows under the weight. Overseers watch, shouting commands, urging them to pull harder, to move faster. The sun above is unrelenting, pressing down until sweat pours in rivers, stinging their eyes. Yet they continue, for the task is not theirs alone, but belongs to their Pharaoh. To them, he is not only a man, but the axis of the world, the living embodiment of the gods. To build for him is to build for eternity. When the stones reach the construction site, the true choreography begins. Ramps of packed earth rise higher and higher as the pyramid grows, long slopes that wrap around the sides. Men haul the blocks upward, step by step, rhythm by rhythm, like ants building a nest larger than themselves. Voices rise in chants, not just to keep time, but to drown out exhaustion, to give courage where muscles fail. The sound is deep and resonant, carrying across the desert plain, human voices binding stone and spirit together. Can you imagine placing your strength into something you would never live to see completed? Thousands labor for decades, yet only the Pharaoh will rest within those walls. Still, the workers find pride. Each stone set is proof that their hands have touched eternity. Among them are skilled craftsmen, carvers who smooth rough edges into clean lines, who inscribe signs that speak not to mortals, but to the gods. Hieroglyphs bloom across the surfaces like vines of meaning, recording prayers, names, invocations to protect what is hidden inside. Artisans mix pigments from ochre, malachite, and charcoal, painting the walls of tombs with scenes of harvests, hunts, and feast worlds meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Their brushes move delicately, almost tenderly, for they believe that what is painted here becomes real in the realm beyond. Around the construction site, life is its own village. Worker settlements rise from mud brick, crowded but alive with activity. The fires crackle, bread bakes, children run through the alleys, and wives carry jars of water balanced on their heads. At dawn, men march back to the site, shoulders squared, tools in hand. At dusk, they return with bodies aching, but spirits still bound by community. Beer flows, laughter rises, songs are sung of heroes and gods. Fatigue is real, but so too is the sense of belonging. They are not slaves here, but laborers serving both king and cosmos. Still, accidents are common. A rope snaps and a block tumbles, crushing limbs. A man falls from a ramp, his body broken. Death is no stranger to the work. Yet even in mourning, the chants continue because the stone does not wait. Some say the gods themselves whisper encouragement into weary ears. Others believe that the Pharaoh's spirit, still alive, watches them and lends strength. In truth, it is only the endurance of men that raises stone to sky. When night falls, the half-built pyramid casts long shadows across the sand, like a stairway unfinished. Torches flicker around the base, their smoke curling upward, stars glimmering above as if mirroring the lights below. Men lie on mats, staring at the pyramid looming in silhouette. They whisper to each other of what it will look like when finished. Its sides smooth as a mirror, gleaming white in the sun, its peak tipped with gold. To imagine such a thing is to believe in a promise that their toil is not wasted, that their lives are threads woven into something greater than themselves. Would you have joined them on those ramps? Would you have lent your body to stone, your sweat to history, knowing the pyramid would never carry your name? The night wind brushes over the desert, carrying the grit of the day and the scent of the river in the distance. The pyramid waits, a giant in its cradle, fed each day by the strength of men who rise with the sun and return with the stars. It will rise for years still, long after the hands that first touched its foundation are dust. Yet even so it grows, step by step, chant by chant, toward a horizon that seems endless. The Nile is more than water. It is the pulse of the land, the clock by which all life moves. To live in Egypt is to live at the mercy of its cycles. When the river swells in the flood season, the valley comes alive with possibility. Mud, dark and rich, spreads across the fields, leaving behind a skin of fertile soil that will feed thousands. When the waters retreat, villagers step onto the new ground with simple wooden plows. Drawn by oxen, their feet sinking into the damp earth as they carve shallow furrows. Barley, emmer, wheat, flax, these are sown in patient rows, their seeds covered with a prayer whispered to the gods. Farming is not simply labor, it is ritual. Each furrow is a promise, each seed a plea for survival. The farmer bends with the rhythm of the earth. His days are tied to the sun's path, his body growing old before its time. The tools he holds are crude, yet efficient, unchanged for centuries. A mattock for breaking the soil, a sickle for harvest, woven from wood and flint blades set in resin. They gleam dull under the sun, their edges sharp enough to cut through stalks of grain with a satisfying crack. The women follow behind, carrying baskets woven from reeds, gathering the cut grain, stacking it high until their arms ache. These moments of work carry a steady hum, a rhythm of voices rising and falling like the river itself. Food is everything here, and it is rationed with care. Bread and beers, those are the staples of every table, from the poorest peasant to the pharaoh himself. Beer is not the golden, foaming drink you imagine today, but a thick, porridge-like brew, cloudy with grains. It fills the belly, keeps thirst at bay, and carries a faint sweetness. Bread is baked daily in clay ovens. Its crust hard, its inside dense. To taste it is to taste Egypt itself, for every crumb carries the labor of fields and hands. Livestock add another rhythm to life. Goats bleat restlessly in the morning, their calls echoing across the village walls. Cattle, prized above all, are led to the river to drink, their hides gleaming under the relentless sun. A single ox can plow enough land to feed a family, and its strength is measured in prayers offered to Hathor, goddess of fertility and protection. Chickens scratch at the dust near doorways, their eggs gathered by small children whose laughter rings through the courtyards. Nothing is wasted. Dung is fuel for the hearth. Reeds cut from the marshes are turned into mats, sandals, baskets, even boats. Yet farming is more than survival. It is an offering to the gods. Every ear of grain, Every stalk of flax belongs, in the end, to Osiris, Lord of the underworld, who first taught humanity the gift of agriculture. Farmers pause at harvest to leave a token offering, a sheaf placed at the edge of the field, a whispered thanks carried on the wind. Even the poorest man knows the cycle of life and death is bound to the land. To reap without giving thanks is to invite misfortune. Children learn their place early. A boy of 6 may already trail behind his father, hands small on the plow, mimicking the motions with pride. A girl learns from her mother how to grind grain with a heavy stone, her arms aching as she pushes back and forth, reducing kernels to flour. Their games echo the adult world. Mock battles with sticks, songs of harvest sung with squeals of laughter. They are raised to inherit the same labors, the same rituals, a cycle unbroken as the Nile itself. The village itself hums with life. Mud brick houses cluster together, their flat roofs used for sleeping on hot nights when the air inside grows stifling. Chickens roost on ladders propped against walls, and small children scramble barefoot across rooftops, as though the houses were extensions of the earth. In courtyards, women knead dough, their hands white with flour, while others weave flax into linen. The fibers pulled and twisted until they shimmer like sunlight on water. The fabric will clothe the family, simple tunics for the men, sheath dresses for the women, all bleached white to reflect the sun. To live here is to live surrounded by the smell of baking bread, the sound of livestock, the ever-present laughter of children, and the low murmur of prayers. Beyond the village, fields stretch into the horizon, but beyond those fields lies the desert, eternal and unforgiving. The desert is a reminder of what lies beyond order, a chaos always pressing at the edges of life. Sandstorms sweep across the horizon without warning, their winds howling like spirits. Travelers caught in them may never return. For villagers, the desert is both fear and boundary. To step too far is to court death, for without the Nile, there is nothing but dust and silence. Still, the desert has its gifts. From its stones come the materials that will build temples and tombs, eternal homes for the gods and the pharaohs. Quarries echo with the ring of copper chisels, men sweating in the sun as they hammer at unyielding rock. To carve a single block can take days. To move it requires dozens of men, ropes, and sheer willpower. And yet these same men return at night to their homes by the river to share beer, bread, and stories under the stars. Work and life are not separate, they are one endless cycle. Religion is woven into every breath. The gods are not distant figures. They walk in every shadow, watch over every meal. Before stepping into the fields, a farmer pours a libation of beer onto the soil, murmuring to Hapi, the god of the Nile, whose flood is both life and destruction. Mothers hang amulets around the necks of their children, carved from stone or molded from clay, in the shapes of eyes, scarabs, or tiny gods. These are not mere ornaments, but shields against the unseen dangers that lurk in the night. The smell of incense drifts from small shrines set in corners of the village, carried on the desert wind. It is not only survival, but meaning that they seek. To live is to be part of a grand cycle: birth, toil, death, and the hope of eternity. The people of Egypt believe death is not an end, but a passage. The same reverence they show to the land, they show to the body, for each carries the spark of eternity. At night, when the fires die low, villagers gather to tell stories of gods who wrestle, weep, and triumph. The myths are not entertainment alone. They are truths wrapped in metaphor, lessons passed through the generations like heirlooms. And when the harvest is good, there is music. Harps plucked under starlight, drums beating a rhythm that calls to the heart, flutes carved from reeds sending high notes into the desert sky. The people dance in circles, their movements a mirror of the stars above. In these moments, life feels abundant, eternal, as though the Nile itself has promised to never fail them. Yet always there is the question, whispered as the waters rise and fall, will the flood come again? Will it be enough? Too much, and fields drown, too little, and famine stalks the land? Each year is a gamble with the gods, each season is a prayer. Would you have trusted your life to the river's mercy, or sought power elsewhere? In offerings, in rituals, in whispered bargains with the unseen? Stone. To the Egyptian, it is not just material. It is eternity given form. Mud brick houses may crumble, reeds may rot, but stone endures. That is why the Pharaoh commands it, why temples rise from it, why tombs are sealed within it. To build in stone is to declare defiance against time itself. And so, as dawn spills across the desert horizon, work begins on the structures that will outlast the men who raised them. The builders are many. Not slaves as so many imagine, but farmers called to labor during the flood season. When their fields lie beneath the Nile's waters and their plows rest idle, for 3 or 4 months each year, they leave behind their villages and gather at royal building sites. Thousands of men, organized in rotating crews, each team marked by a symbol, a gazelle, a lotus, a falcon painted on the walls of their quarters. They joke, they sing, they compete in strength. For though the work is backbreaking, it is also an honor. To labor for Pharaoh is to labor for the gods themselves. Their tools are simple, yet in their simplicity lies genius. Copper chisels, stone hammers, wooden mallets, ropes woven from papyrus, sledges carved from timber. Nothing more than what the land itself provides. Yet from these tools will rise monuments that reach toward the sky. Quarries echo with the sharp clang of hammer against chisel, the air thick with dust. Men squat low, muscles straining as they pry loose massive blocks of limestone. Each cut, each strike is measured, for mistakes cannot be undone. These stones are not faceless rock, they are destined to become temples. Obelisks, tombs, monuments that will proclaim Pharaoh's name long after memory fades. Moving the stone is an ordeal in itself. A block can weigh as much as a dozen men combined. They are hauled onto sledges, dragged across packed sand by ropes gripped in calloused hands. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, lean forward together, their voices rising in chants that keep rhythm to the pull. Water is poured before the sledges to slick the sand, reducing friction, easing the burden just enough to make progress. Step by step, inch by inch, the stones move their weight, a constant reminder of the balance between man and monument. Would you have joined the pull, sweating in the desert heat? Your back bent, your throat raw with dust, for a structure that would never be yours? Temporary camps rise near the building sites, villages of laborers who live, eat, and sleep in the shadow of their task. Mud brick dormitories line narrow streets, each housing rows of men who collapse onto reed mats after the day's toil. Bread ovens bake ceaselessly, producing loaves to feed the masses. Beer, thick and nourishing, is ladled into clay jars, its sour tang a comfort after hours beneath the punishing sun. Cattle are slaughtered, their meat shared in great feasts during festivals or as rewards for the hardest crews. The workers eat better here than they might in their villages. For Pharaoh ensures their strength is sustained. But food alone does not bind them as pride. To carve stone, to raise walls, to see your mark left in mortar, or graffiti scratched in hidden corners, this is legacy. Workers scrawl their names and jokes on unfinished surfaces. The drunkards of Menkar, the friends of Khufu, Ga. They are not anonymous laborers, but men with voices, with laughter, with bonds forged in the sweat of shared struggle. The pyramids, the temples, the obelisks are not silent monuments alone. They are also the echoes of the people who gave their bodies to them. At the heart of the building site stands the overseer, a man of rank, his head shaved, his linen robe crisp in the sun. He carries a staff, not to strike, but to command. His voice directs the rhythm of labor, his eye measures the alignment of stone. Geometry and astronomy guide his hand. For though the labor is muscle, the design is intellect. The rising sun, the stars, the solstices, all are woven into the layout of the structures. Each line, each corner, each angle is measured against the cosmos itself. In this way, the Pharaoh's tomb or temple is not simply a building, it is a mirror of the universe. Priests walk the site as well, whispering prayers, pouring offerings, blessing the work. Before the first stone is set, incense is burned and libations spilled on the ground to appease the gods of the earth. Without their favor, no wall would rise, no tomb would seal. Every stone laid is both an act of engineering and an act of devotion. Men labor not only for Pharaoh, but for the cosmic order, the balance that sustains the world. Build is to align human effort with divine will. The noise of work rises like a chorus. The clang of copper, the grind of sledges, the call of overseers, the grunts of men straining against ropes. Dust coats their skin, their lips crack under the dry air. But the river lies always nearby, its waters offering relief. At midday, they pause, stripping down to wade into its cool current, washing the grit from their bodies, splashing and laughing like children before returning to the grind. Even in toil there is joy, for the work is shared, the goal immense. And as the walls rise, so too does the vision of permanence. Imagine watching a pyramid grown in an instant, not in a year, but over decades. Day after day, the same motions, the same chants, the same burdens. Slowly, impossibly, the shape takes form. Step by step, stone by stone, a mountain rises from the desert. Generations may pass before it is finished, fathers and sons laboring on the same monument. Would you have believed, seeing it rise before your eyes, that it was the work of men at all? Or would you have thought the gods themselves pushed the stones into place? In the evenings, when the sun dies in a blaze of red, the desert cools, and the workers gather around fires, storytellers raise their voices, recounting the myths of Ra sailing his solar bark, of Isis's cunning, of Osiris's resurrection. Songs echo across the sands, their rhythm like the chants of the day, but now filled with laughter and warmth. Beer flows freely, men joke about their overseers, and for a brief time the weight of the stones is forgotten, but not all is joy. Injuries are common, backs broken, hands crushed, fevers brought by infection. A slip of rope, a falling stone, a misstep on scaffolding can end a life in an instant. The dead are carried to simple graves, laid with care, for even laborers deserve passage to the next world. Small amulets are placed with them, a few words whispered to guide them through Duat, the underworld. Death is never far in Egypt, yet it is never final. Every man who labors here believes he has a chance at eternity, however humble. And above all stands Pharaoh, distant yet omnipresent. His cartouche is carved into blocks before they are even set, his name bound into the stone. He does not lift the rocks, does not drag the sledges, but his presence is in every act. For to build for Pharaoh is to build for Egypt itself, for the gods, for the promise that life and order will endure. Each stone is a prayer, each wall a hymn, each monument a bridge between earth and heaven. At the heart of Egypt's cities and sacred landscapes stand the temples. To the people, these are not just houses of prayer, but the very homes of the gods themselves. Each temple is a living body, a bridge between heaven and earth, where stone columns rise like papyrus stalks and ceilings mimic the star-strewn sky. When a man or woman approaches its gates, they do not see only walls and statues. They step into a world where divine order is maintained, where the breath of gods lingers in incense, and where Pharaoh's role as mediator between mortals and eternity is most vividly revealed. At dawn, when the first light brushes the Nile and the desert glows gold, the temple priests begin their work. Their lives are bound to ritual, 2 cycles of offering, to the careful reenactment of myths older than memory itself. A priest rises in silence, shaves his head smooth and bathes in sacred water, purifying body and spirit. He dresses not in lavish robes, but in linen, clean and white, for purity is his shield. No priest may enter the sanctuary without this cleansing, for the god must be approached in perfection. Inside the temple, the air is cool, shaded from the fierce sun outside. Courtyards open into pillared halls, their columns carved with scenes of Pharaoh smiting enemies, of gods bestowing life. The hieroglyphs gleam faintly with paint and plaster, though the years will one day strip them bare. At the farthest chamber lies the sanctuary, the innermost room, sealed to all but the highest priests. Here rests the god's statue, a sacred form hidden in a shrine of gilded wood. Few eyes will ever see it, yet all believe it is alive, for within this image dwells the essence of divinity itself. The morning ritual begins with awakening the god. The shrine doors are unsealed, incense curls into the air, and hymns are murmured in ancient cadences. The priest bows low, sweeping the floor with his hand to clear impurity before stepping forward. He opens the shrine and greets the deity as one would greet a living king. Awake, great one, awake to the day. The statue is bathed with water, anointed with oils, dressed in fine garments. Jewelry is placed upon it, food and drink set before it, bread, beer, meat, fruits. The god eats not as men eat, but by consuming the essence of the offerings. Once the ritual is complete, the food is removed and later shared among the priests, blessed as divine remnants. To maintain this cycle is to maintain the balance of the universe. Without offerings, the gods would weaken, chaos would seep into the world, and the Nile might fail to flood. The people may never see the rituals, for the sanctuary is closed to common eyes, yet they trust in them. Just as the sun rises without their command, so too does the god's presence endure because the priests serve tirelessly. Imagine the faith required to labor daily in darkness, in silence, in devotion, believing that your unseen work keeps heaven and earth aligned. Would you, watching incense vanish into the air, believe that you had helped steady the very course of the cosmos? Beyond ritual lies the life of the temple itself. For these are not only spiritual centers, but also engines of Egypt's economy. Temples own fields, herds, fisheries, workshops, and granaries. They collect offerings, tributes, taxes. Their estates stretch across the land, feeding not only priests, but farmers, craftsmen, and servants. To belong to a temple is to belong to a world within a world. Craftsmen carve statues of gods, goldsmiths fashion amulets, scribes record inventories of grain and cattle. The hum of daily labor surrounds the temple as surely as prayer does. It is not a cloistered place, but a thriving hub, alive with both devotion and commerce. Festivals transform the temples into stages of wonder. On these days, the gods themselves emerge from their sanctuaries, carried in golden barks upon the shoulders of priests. Crowds gather, filling the avenues, singing hymns, waving branches of palm and lotus. Music rises, drums pounding, sistrums rattling, flutes wailing in joyous cadence. For the common people, who may never enter the sanctuary, this is their chance to behold the presence of their God. They see the sacred bark glinting in the sun, its canopy draped in shimmering cloth, and they feel for a moment that eternity has passed before their eyes. One of the grandest of these is the Opet festival in Thebes. Each year, the statue of Ammon is carried from his great temple at Karnak to Luxor, a procession that binds heaven, earth, and Pharaoh in one. Crowds line the processional avenue, its sphinxes watching silently as priests march past. The king himself joins, for it is here that his divine role is renewed. In public view, Pharaoh is not only ruler, but also son of the gods, the living Horus on earth. The people cheer not merely for a man, but for the eternal cycle that ensures the Nile will flood, the sun will rise, and life will endure. Step closer now. Imagine yourself in the midst of that festival. Oppressive bodies around you, the heat of the sun on your head, the sharp tang of incense thick in the air. Music vibrates in your chest, voices rise like waves. You glimpse the sacred bark as it sways past, veiled but radiant. And for a heartbeat, you believe that the god is indeed present, looking upon you. Would you bow low? Would you cry out with the crowd? Or would you watch in silence, wondering at the power of faith that unites so many? Temples are also places of knowledge. Their walls hide libraries where scrolls rest in neat rows, recording hymns, rituals, medical treatises, star charts, and accounts. Priests study here, memorizing the movements of stars, the cycles of the moon, the formulas of healing. Astronomy guides festivals, medicine heals bodies, hymns soothes spirits all within the temple's orbit. Knowledge itself is sacred, for it brings order, and order is mat. Scribes bend over their palettes, pens of reeds scratching ink onto papyrus. Each mark is a tether to eternity, a way to hold fleeting breath and thought in permanence. As night falls, the temple does not slumber. Torches flicker in the courtyards, guards pace with spears in hand, and the god rests within the sealed sanctuary, silent but eternal. Outside, the city may sleep, fishermen may rest on their mats, children may curl against their mothers, but within these walls, time stretches differently. The gods, after all, do not sleep. Priests rise even at night for rituals of protection, to drive away demons, to strengthen the power of Pharaoh. Somewhere in the dark halls, incense still curls, faint and ghostly, toward the painted ceilings of stars. For those who lived in Egypt, the temple was not simply a place. It was the heart of the world. It bound heaven and earth, pharaoh and peasant, life and afterlife. It was stone and spirit, wealth and devotion, labor and prayer. And though centuries will pass, though temples will crumble, their echoes endure. Step into their ruins today, and you still feel the weight of silence, as though the god's breath lingers, waiting to be awakened again. If you had stood there, watched the priest bathe the statue, smelled the incense, heard the chants, would you have believed it was enough to keep the sun rising, the Nile flooding, the stars turning? Or would you have wondered if the gods truly lived in gilded wood and stone, or only in the hearts of the people who loved them? Beyond the farmers who fed Egypt stood another group that shaped the kingdom in quieter, yet lasting ways. The craftsmen and scribes. These were the men whose hands built temples and carved statues, whose red pens captured the words of Pharaoh and the gods. While the farmer's plow kept Egypt alive from day to day, it was the skill of these artisans and record keepers that clothed Egypt in its enduring image of grandeur. Imagine walking through a bustling workyard in Thebes or Memphis. The sun beats down on half-built columns, stone chips scatter underfoot, hammers ring on limestone. Men with strong arms haul blocks into place, ropes straining as gangs of workers chant in rhythm. Overseers bark orders. Scribes stand nearby with tablets to record deliveries of stone, timber, copper, tools. Every detail is noted, for in Egypt, order is sacred, chaos unthinkable. The stonemasons are the backbone of construction. Working with chisels of copper and later bronze, they smooth the faces of blocks, carving with patience that seems endless. Dust coats their skin, sweat trickles down their backs. Yet they know their work will outlast them. Some carve hieroglyphs into stone walls, shaping birds, eyes, and gods into messages meant to endure for eternity. Would you envy their pride in such permanence, or pity the calluses and aching muscles earned by endless repetition? Woodworkers labor in shaded courtyards, crafting furniture, chests, boats, and statues. Cedar imported from Lebanon is precious, cut with care, shaped into beams for temples or coffins for nobles. A craftsman leans close, carving a delicate figure of the god base. Protector of the household, his hands steady despite the dim light. Nearby, potters sit by their wheels, clay spinning as vessels rise beneath their fingers. The smell of wet earth fills the air as jars for grain, amphorae for beer, bowls for offerings take shape. When fired in kilns, they emerge hardened, ready to serve families and temples alike. In another quarter, metalworkers toil beside furnaces. Flames glow, copper and gold glint in the light. They hammer jewelry into delicate chains, shape tools, forge blades. Goldsmiths work for temples and nobles, producing treasures destined for tombs. Imagine holding a necklace of hammered gold, its surface gleaming like sunlight on the Nile. Would you admire the beauty or wonder at the countless hours behind its making? And then there are the scribes, the rare few who live not by muscle, but by mind. Their world is ink and papyrus. Their tools reeds cut to a sharp point, their ink black or red. They sit cross-legged, writing on smooth sheets, recording everything from temple rituals to grain tallies. To be a scribe is to hold power, for in Egypt, words are magic. A document can decide the fate of land, wealth, even lives. The son of a farmer may dream of becoming a scribe, escaping the toil of fields for the dignity of writing. Schools for scribes are harsh students, beaten for mistakes, forced to copy lines again and again. Yet the reward is status, a life of relative comfort, perhaps even proximity to Pharaoh himself. Picture a scribe by lamplight, his reed pen scratching quietly, his lips murmuring the words he writes. Would you prefer such a life of discipline, or the rough honesty of work under the open sun? Life in the workshops is not only labor. Songs and chatter fill the air as men carve and polish. Apprentices joke nervously while older masters grumble about their mistakes. Meals are eaten on the spot. Bread, onions, fish, washed down with beer carried in jars. At night, some workers return to villages, others remain in labor camps near great building projects. These camps are communities themselves, with cooks, bakers, brewers, doctors tending to the men. Work is grueling, but not slavery in the strictest sense. Many are paid in rations or given housing. The construction of great monuments requires thousands, a tide of humanity moving stone and earth. Imagine watching the base of a pyramid rise, blocks sliding into place on ramps, the air filled with dust and shouts. You might wonder if the laborers knew they were making history, or if they only thought of surviving the next day. Yet beyond the toil lies pride. Artisans sign their names in hidden corners of tombs, a quiet defiance against anonymity. A mason might carve a tiny symbol into a block, a way of whispering across the centuries, "I was here." These marks, invisible to the kings they served, speak louder than any monument, for they reveal the hands that built Egypt's eternal face. The artistry is not only grand, but intimate. In small workshops, craftsmen create amulets shaped like scarabs, tiny charms meant to protect their owners. Jewelry of faience gleams in blue and green, cheap enough for commoners, beautiful enough to delight. These objects carry meaning beyond their form. A scarab beetle symbolizes rebirth. An ankh charm promises life. Even in modest homes, such pieces connect people to the divine, blending daily existence with eternal hope. Consider, too, the role of women in these crafts. While men dominated heavy labor, women often worked in weaving, spinning flax into linen. dyeing fabrics with red ochre or indigo. Linen was Egypt's pride, worn by peasants and nobles alike. Women's hands wove the very cloth that wrapped mummies and clothed priests. In quiet courtyards looms creak as threads stretch taut. Voices of women rise in song, their work no less vital than that of stonecutters. Together, scribes and craftsmen created Egypt's identity. Without them, temples would stand bare, tombs empty. Pharaoh's decrees forgotten, their work transformed mud and stone into civilization. Imagine standing in a completed temple, columns towering, walls covered in carved gods, incense smoke curling in the air. Every line of hieroglyphs, every statue of falcons and jackals was shaped by human hands, hands blistered and scarred, yet guided by devotion and skill. In their silence, they speak across millennia, leaving us to wonder not only at the beauty they made, but at the lives they lived behind the tools. Would you have chosen such a path? Carving eternity one chisel strike at a time? Or writing immortality line by line on fragile papyrus? If the Nile gave Egypt life, and the Pharaoh gave it order, then the gods gave it meaning. Every sound of wind over the desert, every cry of an ibis on the riverbank, every flicker of flame in the night was understood as a whisper from the divine. To live in Egypt was to live in the company of gods, beings who watched over every step, punished disorder, and rewarded devotion. They were many, yet together they formed one great balance, a tapestry of myths and powers woven into the rhythm of daily life. In the temples, priests tended to them as if they were kings themselves, bathing their statues, dressing them in fine linen, offering food and incense. These rituals were not symbolic to the Egyptians, they were necessities. For the gods were thought to live through their images, and if neglected, they could withdraw their blessings. Imagine the dawn in a great temple at Karnak. The air is cool. The first light touches columns carved with stories of creation. Priests move silently, their heads shaved, their bodies washed in sacred waters. They approach the inner sanctuary where a statue of Ammon rests behind heavy doors. The high priest chants softly, unlocking the shrine, opening the doors as if waking a sleeping king. He washes the statue with scented water, anoints it with oil, dresses it in fresh linen robes, then presents bread, beer, and meat as offerings. Only a few see this sacred ritual, for the inner chamber is forbidden to common eyes. Outside, however, the temple courtyard fills with incense smoke and the sound of chanting, so that all who pass may feel the god's presence. Would you feel awe, or would you wonder if the stone truly listened? The gods themselves were countless, yet some stood above others. Ra, the sun god, rose each day in his golden bark, sailing across the sky before descending into the underworld at night. Isis, the mother and protector, spread her wings over the people, her magic said to resurrect the dead. Osiris ruled the underworld, offering hope that death was not the end, but a passage. Horus, the falcon, embodied kingship itself, his sharp eyes watching over Pharaoh, his rival Seth lurking always in the background as the force of chaos. Even household gods were revered. Base, the squat, lion-faced protector of women and children, or Toret, the hippopotamus goddess guarding childbirth. To the Egyptians, the divine was everywhere, both mighty and intimate. The people themselves could not enter the sacred shrines, but they brought offerings to the temple gates. Bread, flowers, small amulets. Pilgrims left prayers scratched on walls, pleading for health, fertility, or protection. Festivals opened the doors of the gods, parading statues through the streets so all could glimpse the powers that ruled their world. Imagine standing in the crowd as the statue of Hathor is carried past, adorned with gold, veiled in linen, her face smiling. For a moment, the people are united in reverence, swept into the rhythm of divinity. But religion was not only about worship, it explained life itself. The annual flood of the Nile was believed to be a gift from Hapi, the spirit of the river. When waters rose and spread fertile silt across the fields, it was seen as proof of divine order, the balance known as Mat. That was more than truth or justice, it was the very principle of harmony that kept chaos at bay. Pharaoh's duty was to uphold Mat, and the priest's rituals, the farmer's toil, the scribe's words all served to preserve it. To break Mat was to invite disaster, drought, famine, invasion. Do you feel comfort in such order? Or fear at the thought that one mistake might unravel the world? Death, too, was woven into religion. Egyptians did not see death as an end, but as a journey. The soul, or Ka, would leave the body, wandering until reunited with it. Thus, preservation of the body through mummification was vital. Priests recited spells, wrapped limbs in linen, placed amulets between the folds, all to protect the soul in its perilous voyage. In the afterlife, the soul stood before Osiris, heart weighed against the feather of Mat. If found pure, it was welcomed into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal harvests, clear waters, and gentle breezes. If judged unworthy, the heart was devoured by Ammit, the crocodile lion hippo monster, ending existence forever. Picture the silence of that hall of judgment, the gods seated in rows, Thoth recording the outcome, Anubis steady at the scales. Would you trust your heart to be lighter than a feather? Religion guided not only temples, but homes. Families placed small shrines in their houses, clay figures of protective deities. Women whispered prayers to Toret during childbirth. Farmers asked Hapi for water. Fishermen left offerings before setting out on the Nile. Even the simplest life was tied to the sacred. In the flicker of an oil lamp, in the quiet words spoken at dawn, the divine was present. Dreams were seen as messages from the gods, illness as a punishment or a test, healing as a blessing. Magic and religion blurred into one. Spells written on papyrus were worn as amulets, words believed to carry power as real as stone. Priests specialized in medicine, blending herbs with chants. A man with a snake bite might be treated with honey and herbs, while a charm of horse's eye was recited over the wound. To our eyes it is superstition, yet to them it was a seamless web of meaning, every act carrying weight in both this world and the next. Pharaoh himself was the highest priest. He was Horus on earth, son of Ra, chosen to maintain Mat. Temples glorified him as divine, yet the rituals carried out daily by countless priests were the true engine of belief. In practice, it was these priests, with their knowledge of rites and hymns, who preserved the bond between gods and men. They lived disciplined lives, bound by purity, often celibate, bathing repeatedly to remain ritually clean. Imagine their quiet dedication, their voices echoing in stone halls, their hands lifting offerings no one else could touch. Religion was Egypt's heartbeat. It shaped its art, its laws, its wars. When neighboring peoples threatened, Pharaoh declared the gods commanded defense. When famine struck, rituals were redoubled, temples filled with smoke and prayer. When life prospered, it was credited to the gods' favor. To question the divine order was rare, perhaps dangerous, for without it Egypt itself seemed impossible. The Pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was the living axis of Egypt, the point at which gods and men met, where divine order became earthly law. To look upon him was to look upon Horus, falcon-eyed and eternal, the one who upheld Maat against the chaos that always threatened. His power was absolute, yet his life was bounded by duty, ritual, and the weight of expectation. Every morning while the city stirred awake and fishermen prepared their nets, the Pharaoh's household began its careful routine. Servants moved through the palace in quiet steps, carrying pitchers of water, trays of bread, linen robes freshly washed. In the royal chambers, sunlight filtered through narrow slits, striking polished floors and gilded furniture. The Pharaoh was awakened not like common men but with ritual. Attendants sang hymns of praise, reminding him of his divine nature even as his eyes first opened. Before he ate or dressed, purification came first. Priests waited with bowls of scented water, sprinkling him, anointing his skin with oils infused with lotus and myrrh. His body was not his own, it was the vessel of a god, and every gesture affirmed it. He was dressed in fine linen, pleated with care, and adorned with jewelry that gleamed with gold and carnelian. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was placed upon his head only for ceremonies, but even his daily headdress bore the cobra of protection, symbol of Wajet. When he stepped into the open court, courtiers and guards bowed low. Their eyes averted, for to gaze directly at him without permission was unthinkable. Would you have bowed willingly, or felt unease at honoring flesh, as if it were divine? His meals, though rich, were taken with restraint. Bread made from the finest wheat, honey, figs, roasted duck, fish fresh from the Nile. Yet before eating, offerings of the same food were given to the gods. For Pharaoh was not only nourished by bread, but by the favor of Ra. Scribes stood nearby, reading petitions, recording decrees, reminding him of disputes awaiting judgment. His day was an endless chain of decisions. Taxes to be levied, lands to be granted, punishments to be decided. In theory, his word was law, but in practice, viziers and administrators managed the machinery of state. Yet every choice bore his seal, for it was said Pharaoh spoke with divine truth. The palace itself was a world of order and spectacle. Vast courtyards shaded by columns, walls painted with lotus and papyrus, ceilings glittering with stars. Servants hurried about, eunuchs guarded private chambers, musicians played softly to please him. In the harem, wives and concubines lived in luxury, their rivalries hidden behind smiles. The great queen, often more powerful than any concubine, held a position nearly sacred, sometimes even seen as the earthly embodiment of goddesses like Hathor or Isis. Children ran through side chambers, their laughter echoing against walls of painted stone, heirs and daughters raised in a cradle of expectation. Yet beyond the splendor, duty pressed heavily. Pharaoh must appear before his people, not only in war or ceremony, but in festivals. The sight of him, radiant in gold, his face painted with kohl, his steps steady as drums beat, reassured the land that order was preserved. Crowds gathered to glimpse him carried on a golden litter or riding in a chariot, the sun gleaming from polished metal. They shouted blessings, not simply as subjects but as worshippers. His role was more than politicalite, was sacred theater, a performance that bound heaven and earth. Temples consumed much of his day. He visited sanctuaries, offered incense, recited prayers written by priests, presided over great rituals during festivals. At times, he himself struck down animals in symbolic hunts, representing the triumph of Maat over chaos. Each act, whether offering to Amun or raising a ceremonial hoe to break ground for a temple, was more than gesture. It was magic made real through his presence. The scribes, ever faithful, followed him everywhere. They wrote his words in careful hieroglyphs, carved decrees on stelae, recorded tributes from foreign lands. Through them, Pharaoh's voice echoed across Egypt, from the marshes of the delta to the delta to the delta, without scribes. Even divine command might vanish in the winds of time, but with them, Pharaoh's breath became eternal. Justice was one of his heaviest burdens. Petitioners came before him more before his vizier, on his behalf seeking resolution to disputes. A stolen cow, a boundary contested, a servant accused of disobedience. To us, these are small matters, but in Egypt every decision reflected the balance of Mat. If Pharaoh or his vizier erred, disorder rippled outward like cracks in stone. The weight of a single ruling might shape the fate of a village for generations. When the palace quieted, one imagines Pharaoh walking through pillared halls, torches casting shadows across carved reliefs of his victories, his deeds immortalized in stone. Did he believe himself a god, or did the mask of divinity feel heavy on his shoulders? Surrounded by luxury, he was still bound to mortality, aware that one day he too would journey to Osiris's hall. Yet, unlike common men, he prepared a tomb not simply for himself, but for eternity. Even while alive, artisans labored in hidden valleys, chiseling chambers into rock, filling them with painted walls. Golden coffins, spells to guide him beyond. Every stroke of a chisel was a prayer for his safe passage. His nights were not always peaceful. Dreams carried messages from the gods, and priests of dreams were summoned to interpret them. If he dreamed of snakes, perhaps enemies plotted against him. If he dreamed of the sun rising twice, perhaps Ra had blessed his reign. Such visions weighed heavily, for dreams in Egypt were not mere illusions, but voices of truth. And yet, beneath all this ritual and grandeur, Pharaoh was still human. He could laugh at a jest, delight in music, enjoy the hunt along the desert's edge. He could feel anger, jealousy, perhaps even fear. The double nature of his being, God and man, meant he lived always between two worlds, never entirely one or the other. In council, he might rage against a disobedient general, then in the temple bow humbly before Amen. The palace of the pharaoh was not only a seat of power, but a theater in which divine authority played out in every gesture and glance. To step into its halls was to feel the difference between the ordinary Nile farmer and the one believed to be chosen by the gods themselves. The air was thick with incense, sweet and cloying, asking the sweat of bodies and the dust carried in from the desert winds. Walls gleamed with polished stone, and columns rose like petrified papyrus stalks, painted in deep reds, blues, and gold that caught the flickering light of oil lamps. This was not a home in the sense a villager might imagine, but a stage where every act of the pharaoh carried weight, both political and spiritual. The pharaoh awoke each day before the sun's ascent was visible to most. Priests entered his chamber with hushed chants, invoking Ra to rise as they helped their living god emerge from sleep. His body was bathed in perfumed oils, his skin brushed with powders, his head adorned with ceremonial wigs and crowns, depending on the day's rituals. Even the act of dressing was more than vanity. It was a statement that order had triumphed once again over chaos. The people believed that so long as their pharaoh maintained the rituals, Nile would flood, crops would grow, and the sun would continue its endless journey across the sky. Outside these sacred chambers, officials and scribes waited with their bundles of papyrus, eager to present petitions or seek approval for construction, trade, or disputes. The pharaoh's word was final, yet few words were wasted. A nod, a pause, a gesture of his hand could seal the fate of a village or elevate a family into wealth for generations. At the edges of the hall, soldiers stood motionless, their spears gleaming in the lamplight. Their silence was a reminder that while the Pharaoh was divine, his power also rested on disciplined men who could enforce his command with brutal efficiency. Yet beneath the grandeur and rigidity, there was a man whose childhood had been spent in the same heat and under the same moon as any other. He had once learned to read hieroglyphs, to steady his hand with the bow, to run along the banks of the river with other boys. What difference separated him now from the farmers who bent their backs in the fields? The belief of his people and the structures of power woven around that belief. At midday, the Pharaoh was carried through the palace courtyards where sunlight spilled down, and musicians plucked at harps while singers chanted hymns. The courtiers followed, offering petitions or flattery, and sometimes both disguised as one another. Queens and royal children appeared at intervals, cloaked in linen garments and jewelry that shimmered like stars. Their lives too were bound to ceremony. Affection was displayed rarely and behind walls. The royal household was less a family than a constellation of roles orbiting the Pharaoh. Each depended on his light. Meals were another ritual. While peasants ate barley bread and onions, the Pharaoh's table bore roasted goose, honey cakes, figs, and wines brought from distant lands. Yet it was not indulgence alone, for priests oversaw even his diet, ensuring that purity and symbolism infused what he consumed. Every bite reaffirmed his divine state. Just as every offering burned before the temple gods echoed the balance of Mat, the principle of universal order. As evening fell, the Pharaoh presided over councils where matters of war, trade, and law were debated. Merchants might present exotic goods from Nubia, lapis lazuli from far-off lands, or tales of foreign rulers. Generals spoke of borders that needed guarding, raiders that threatened villages, or campaigns that would bring glory and resources. The Pharaoh listened, measured, and then decided, his word flowing out into the land as surely as the river. For the common villager, these decisions were distant, yet their consequences would ripple outward, shaping the weight of taxes, the safety of fields, and the stability of life itself. When night cloaked the palace, rituals began again. Priests recited prayers to guide the sun god safely through the underworld so that dawn might return. Torches flickered, casting long shadows across painted walls where gods and kings were carved in eternal stances. The Pharaoh himself retreated to chambers heavy with incense, where dreams were believed to be whispers from the divine. His rest was no mere sleep but another duty, for omens carried through dreams might shape tomorrow's decrees. Outside, the Nile reflected moonlight, and farmers lay on their mats, exhausted but content, unaware of the weight their ruler carried. Yet somewhere, in that fragile space, between night and dawn, between God and man, the Pharaoh turned in his bed. Another mortal beneath a veil of ceremony? Would you have seen him as divine had you stood in those halls? Or would you have glimpsed only a man dressed and painted in power? Beyond the palace gates, life along the Nile pulsed with a rhythm that had endured for centuries. The river was not only water, but the heartbeat of the land, dictating the pace of work, the breath of crops, the rise and fall of kingdoms themselves. Every year the flood came, bringing silt so dark and fertile it seemed a gift from the gods. Without it, the land would turn to dust. Farmers watched the waters anxiously, reading the signs, offering prayers to Hapi, the god of the inundation, for too little water meant famine, and too much meant destruction. At dawn, men waded into the fields with wooden hoes, their feet sinking into mud still cool from the night air. They bent and lifted, bent and lifted, their bodies lean and hardened by repetition. Children scampered at the edges of the furrows, chasing birds or helping carry baskets of seed. Women ground grain with heavy stones, their arms moving in circles as steady as the rising sun, the rhythm echoing like a drumbeat that never ceased. The scent of damp earth mingled with smoke from small fires where bread was baking. and voices rose in song to make the labor lighter. Hieroglyphs carved on temple walls often depicted Pharaoh scattering seed or tilling fields, but this was no more than sacred performance. In truth, it was these villagers who bore the weight of the harvest, their sweat ensuring the palace could feast. Temples could burn offerings and armies could march. Scribes traveled among them, tallying grain, measuring with cords, marking symbols onto papyrus. Their presence was both feared and tolerated, for they represented the hand of the state. Each tax recorded meant less bread for a family, yet refusal was unthinkable. Soldiers could be dispatched in an instant, and whispers told of villages punished for hiding grain. Yet there was pride too, for to provide was to uphold Mat, the balance that kept the universe in order. To fail was not only a hardship, but a disruption of cosmic harmony. As the sun climbed higher, the fields shimmered with heat, and workers wiped sweat with linen cloths tied around their foreheads. Shade was rare, and so they leaned on their hoes or sat briefly by the canal banks, letting water lap at their feet. Here gossip flowed as freely as the current who had married, who had quarreled. Which priest had been seen taking extra offerings? Which official had grown to fat on bribes? Life was simple, but it was not silent, and laughter mingled with complaints, as it always had. Fishing was another lifeline. Nets cast wide into the Nile, weighted with stones, then pulled back, dripping with tilapia and perch. Boys splashed into the shallows, driving fish toward the nets, while older men sharpened hooks carved from bone or copper. The smell of fish drying in the sun was ever present, a reminder that the river gave as much sustenance as the fields. Some days brought hippos or crocodiles too close to shore, and men carried spears, shouting to drive them off. Single misstep could mean death, and yet these dangers were accepted as the cost of life tied to the Nile. When the work was done, families returned to modest mud-brick homes, their walls cool against the day's lingering heat. Inside, floors were hard-packed earth, furniture sparse, but the heart of each home was the hearth. Bread, onions, lentils, and occasionally dried fish or figs made their meals. Clay jars of beer, thick and nourishing, were shared in the evenings as stories were told. Children drifted to sleep on mats while elders spoke of ancestors, of spirits that lingered in tombs, and of the eternal cycle of flood and harvest. Even leisure was bound to the rhythms of survival. Games with knuckle bones or carved boards offered moments of escape, while music filled the air on festival days, flutes, drums, and sistrums rattling as women danced with arms raised to the sky. Temples called villagers to ceremonies where offerings of bread, beer, and incense were placed before towering statues. Though most never glimpsed the pharaoh, they believed he stood as the bridge between themselves and the gods. Faith was not questioned but lived, woven into every action, every breath of daily life. And yet beneath the songs and rituals, there lingered quiet worries. Would the Nile flood again this year? Would the fields bear enough grain to feed both temple and table? Would disease take a child in the night? Or soldiers demand service for a distant war? These were the questions whispered around firelight, too fragile to speak aloud in daylight. As night fell, the land cooled, and stars shimmered above the desert like shards of polished stone. Families stepped outside to breathe in the softer air, gazing up at constellations their ancestors had known since time uncounted. The jackal's cry echoed from the dark edges of the desert, and the Nile gleamed silver beneath the moon. Here was the true rhythm of Egypt, not the decrees of a distant palace, not the carved stone of temples, but the heartbeat of ordinary people living, working, and dreaming beneath the same sky. And as they lay down to rest on mats spread across rooftops, they could not know that centuries later their simple lives would be studied, debated, and remembered. To them, it was simply another day, another night, another breath in the endless cycle of Nile and desert. If the fields and the Nile were the body of Egypt, the temples were its soul. Rising from the earth with columns carved like lotus stalks and walls etched with prayers, they stood as reminders that the gods were never far. Even in small villages, shrines of mud brick held offerings, while in great cities, temples loomed with stone grandeur that cast shadows across marketplaces. The air within smelled of incense, thick and heavy, curling toward painted ceilings where stars had been drawn to mirror the heavens. Priests moved silently, their shaved heads gleaming in the lamplight, their linen robes white as bone. Each motion was ritual, every word spoken part of a cycle that bound gods and men together. At dawn, priests approached the sealed chamber where a statue of the deity rested. Before opening the doors, they purified themselves in sacred lakes, cleansed their mouths with natron, washed their bodies to erase any impurity. Then they opened the chamber, bowed low, and began the daily rites. The god statue was not just stone or gold, it was thought to hold the essence of the divine. It was awakened with hymns, clothed in fine linen, perfumed with oils, offered bread and beer. The statue was then resealed, hidden from mortal eyes, until the next day. Ordinary villagers never saw these acts, for the god's presence was shielded from the common gaze. Their role was to gather outside, to bring offerings of food or trinkets, to pray for fertility, protection, or relief from sickness. Priests spoke on their behalf, though whispers often wondered how much of the offerings found their way to divine hands, and how much remained in human ones. Still, to question too loudly was dangerous, and faith endured because faith was necessary. The festivals were the times when that barrier between gods and people dissolved. Processions carried statues of deities out from their sanctuaries, veiled and glittering, borne on the shoulders of chanting priests. Crowds gathered, throwing flowers, clapping, raising their arms to the sky. Music filled the air, sistrums shaking, drums thundering, flutes weaving through the rhythm like river currents. On these days, beer flowed freely and laughter rolled through the streets. It was as if the gods had stepped down to walk among them, and the burden of work and hunger was forgotten for a moment. Markets thrived on such days too, stalls heavy with figs, honey cakes, jars of perfume, copper tools, linen cloth, beads of turquoise and carnelian. Bargaining filled the air, voices rising and falling like waves. Merchants arrived on boats from upriver, their hulls stacked with baskets of grain, pottery, and occasionally exotic goods brought from Nubia or lands even farther. A single carved ivory comb or a scarab amulet could pass through many hands, each owner imagining it a charm against the unknown. Among the bustle, one figure always stood out: the scribe, papyrus scrolls in hand, red pens tucked neatly into small cases. They recorded transactions, documented taxes, and made lists that stretched endlessly. To read and write was a skill few possessed, and so the scribe's power lay not in sword or hoe, but in ink. Their words carved permanence into fleeting exchanges. And in a land that worshipped eternity, that was power beyond measure. Parents dreamed of their sons entering this path, for it meant freedom from fields, lighter work, and the respect of officials. Yet not every child was destined for such schooling. Most continued the cycle of hoe and plow, carrying Egypt on their backs. In quieter corners of the marketplace, healers spread mats with herbs and jars. They mixed honey with ground roots, applied poultices of clay, whispered incantations as they worked. Was not separate from magic. The two were bound together, for disease was thought to be the work of angry spirits or displeased gods. A broken bone might be splinted with reeds and bound in linen, but always an amulet was tied around the wrist. Always a prayer was spoken to ward off harm. Death, when it came, was never far from thought. Funerals were as important as births, for to neglect the dead was to condemn them to wander. coffins of wood painted with protective spells were carried to tombs, accompanied by wailing women who tore their hair and smeared ash on their faces. Inside the tomb, food, beer, clothing, and charms were left, for the journey into the afterlife was thought as real as the journey across the desert. The living carried grief, but also certainty. The dead did not vanish. They continued, if properly cared for. The Nile at night mirrored this belief, its dark current flowing steadily under the stars. Just as it disappeared into the horizon only to return again with the flood, so too did life ebb and return. People whispered of fields of reeds beyond death, a perfect Egypt where toil was light and food plentiful. Such visions made the struggles of daily life bearable, for they believed it was not the end. Children fell asleep to such stories, clutching small amulets shaped like scarabs or ankhs, their breathing soft beneath the night winds. Even as sand hissed across stone and jackals prowled at the edges of the desert, the heart of Egypt beat steady. Gods unseen, Pharaoh distant, death inevitably yet life endured. And in that endurance, Egypt found its immortality, built not only in temples and tombs, but in the quiet resilience of those who lived beneath the eternal stars. The desert was never silent, though at first it seemed so. Stand at its edge and you would hear only your own breath, the crunch of sand beneath your feet, the faint stir of wind. Yet listen longer, and other sounds crept in, the hiss of grains shifting against one another, the low cry of a distant bird, the occasional bark of a jackal, carried thin across the night air. The people of Egypt lived at the border of this vast emptiness, both fearing and revering it. The desert was death, yet it was also protection. Armies could not easily cross its burning expanses, and tombs hidden deep within its cliffs lay shielded from invaders by its very desolation. By day it was an oven, the air shimmering, the stones so hot they seemed to glow. By night, it was a realm of cold, where stars blazed sharper than any torch. Villages near its edges lived with constant awareness of its power. 4 crops grew only because the Nile fought back the sands. A bad flood meant the desert crept closer, swallowing fields, stealing life. Farmers tilled their soil carefully, always wary of losing a handful more earth to the dunes. For them, the desert was both enemy and reminder, a looming presence that taught humility. Out there in the sands, beyond the reach of fertile ground, lay tombs carved into rock faces. Some were simple shafts with rough walls, others elaborate chambers decorated with bright colors, scenes of boats, gods, fields. Banquets, all images meant to guide the dead toward eternity. Workers toiled under the glare of the sun, chisels tapping steadily, carrying baskets of debris up narrow paths. They sang to keep rhythm, their voices echoing against stone walls, blending with the thud of wooden mallets. Dust clung to their skin, sweat streaked their faces, but they continued, for it was Pharaoh's will. Entire communities were dedicated to these works, living in small, clustered houses near the Valley of the Kings. Their lives were tied to the secrecy of their labor, and punishments for revealing tomb locations were severe. Still, theft was not unknown, for the lure of gold was stronger than fear for some. Guards patrolled paths, officials inspected work, yet whispers of stolen treasures drifted through taverns like smoke. Even as tombs were meant to ensure eternal peace, human greed could disturb their silence. Beyond the desert tombs, the river carried life forward. Boats drifted along its currents, their sails catching the wind, their decks piled with grain, pottery, cattle, or sometimes soldiers on the move. The Nile was not simply water, it was the road, the artery of Egypt. Villages that seemed remote by land were connected by the river's flow, and a journey that might take days across sand could be done in half the time by boat. Children played at the edges of the water, splashing and laughing, while women washed linen against smooth stones. their voices weaving into the air like another kind of current. Fishermen cast nets, drawing in silver flashes that gleamed like scattered stars in the sunlight. Crocodiles lurked, silent and menacing, and prayers to Sobek, the crocodile god, were muttered by those who ventured too far into dangerous waters. Along the banks, papyrus reeds swayed, tall and green. Their stalks harvested to make rope, mats, baskets, and most precious of all, the scrolls that carried words across time. Scribes bent over such papyri with focused care, knowing that the Nile not only gave food, but preserved memory. Without it, there would be no record, no story, no voice reaching forward to the present. As the sun sank each evening, shadows stretched long across the water. Lamps flickered in homes, and smoke from cooking fires drifted skyward. Meals were simple but filling: bread baked in clay ovens, beer brewed from barley, vegetables stewed with herbs, fish roasted over open flames. On rare days, meat was shared, a chicken or duck, sometimes goat, flavored with garlic or onions. Families gathered around, children eating first, elders offering quiet prayers of thanks. Laughter rose, soft and worn, the laughter of people who worked hard and knew the value of small joys. At night, the desert winds picked up, sweeping dust against the walls of houses, rattling doors and shutters. Dogs barked, donkeys shifted restlessly, and somewhere beyond, jackals yipped to one another. People huddled inside under linen blankets, their dreams touched by the murmur of the wind. The stars stretched endless above them, constellations traced by priests and farmers alike. Too many, they were signs from the gods, fixed lights that guided both harvest and destiny. Children fell asleep with these patterns overhead, comforted by the thought that the same stars shone on Pharaoh, on priests, on every village across the two lands. Some wondered what lay beyond them, in the vastness above, but answers were never certain. All they knew was that the gods looked down, and that was enough. In these quiet hours, Egypt was most itself, not in the grandeur of pyramids or the commands of kings, but in the breath of a farmer beside his family, in the hum of insects at the river's edge, in the fragile flame of a lamp keeping darkness at bay. It was in the rhythm of days, the turning of seasons, the endless balance between river and desert, life and death. The desert waited, patient, eternal. The river flowed, constant, eternal. And between them, the people lived, fragile, yet enduring, shaping their world as best they could beneath the weight of sand and sky. The palace was not merely a dwelling, it was the axis upon which Egypt's world turned. While farmers bent over their fields and fishermen cast their nets, Pharaoh's court moved to a rhythm of its own. Courtyards filled with sunlight, columns painted with bright blues and reds, floors polished until they gleamed under sandal and barefoot alike. Servants hurried through the passages carrying jars of water, trays of bread, scrolls, or incense bowls that left trails of smoke curling into the air. The palace smelled of oils, of honeyed wine, of lotus blossoms, carefully arranged in wide stone bowls. To step inside was to step apart from ordinary life, for here decisions were made that reached into every hut and every farm along the Nile. Pharaoh himself was rarely glimpsed except in ceremony, cloaked in fine linen, gold gleaming at his wrists and neck, the crook and flail crossed upon his chest. He was not a man to his people, but a living god. His steps were measured, his gestures deliberate. Those who approached him bowed low, their foreheads to the ground, for to meet his gaze was to meet the sun itself. Yet within those gilded halls, not all was serenity. Whispers ran through the corridors like mice through grain stores. Courtiers sought favor, priests argued quietly with scribes. Generals pressed for campaigns that might expand Egypt's borders, while treasurers fretted over whether the granaries could support another war. Egypt's strength was not only in its monuments or its gods, but in the constant balance of these voices, each pulling at the throne in their own direction. priests moved with a weight that no sword could match. Their temples stretched as vast as any palace, their rituals binding Pharaoh's power to the gods. Each dawn, statues of deities were washed, clothed, fed with offerings of bread, fruit, and wine. Incantations filled the chambers, slow and rhythmic, believed to sustain the very breath of the divine. Without these acts, the gods might withdraw their favor, the floods might fail, the desert might swallow the green lands whole. Pharaoh was seen as Horus in life, Osiris in death. But even he relied on these priests to maintain the bridge between mortal and eternal. The court also housed scribes, men with red pens and sharp minds, their fingers stained with ink. They bent over papyrus, recording taxes, trade, laws, dreams of Pharaoh, carved into words that would outlast generations. To be a scribe was to wield power quietly. Few could read, fewer still could write. And so the flow of words was itself a form of rule. A decree written in careful script held weight across the two lands. While a farmer's memory of a promise might vanish like smoke on the wind, in chambers lit by oil lamps, scribes debated the phrasing of laws, knowing that a single line might alter the fate of villages. Beyond these halls, entertainers added brightness to courtly evenings. Musicians plucked strings of lyres, tapped drums that echoed like heartbeats, and played flutes whose notes wound through the air like birds in flight. Dancers moved with grace, their anklets chiming, their bodies telling stories of gods and battles in a language of gesture. Jesters offered laughter, though carefully, for even mirth, before Pharaoh required balance. A poorly chosen joke could be the last one uttered. Banquets stretched long into the night, goblets refilled, trays of roasted meats brought forth, and wine flowing as freely as the Nile and flood. Yet these feasts also carried the pulse of politics. Alliances were made with a glance, promises whispered over cups, rivalries hinted at beneath the surface of polite words. To serve at Pharaoh's side was to walk upon shifting sand. One day a favorite, the next forgotten, or worse, condemned. Loyalty was prized, but so was usefulness. And when usefulness faded, silence could be swift. Outside the palace, ordinary people looked toward its walls with both awe and distance. To them, Pharaoh was a figure glimpsed in festivals, carried high in processions. His image carved into stone. It was both near and impossibly far. They prayed for his health, for his strength, for his protection, for in his fortune lay their own. Yet their lives continued regardless of whether they ever stepped foot in his presence. For the farmer, the field mattered more than the throne. For the potter, the kiln's heat more than the gold crown. Still on festival days, when the sun burned high and banners fluttered in the breeze, when statues of gods were carried through streets and the smell of incense filled the air, even the humblest villager felt touched by the same divine thread that ran through Pharaoh's heart. The court was grandeur, yes, but it was also fragile. It required constant tending, like a lamp that might gutter if left unattended. Its corridors held secrets, its rooms the echoes of voices plotting futures. And beyond its painted walls, the Nile still rose and fell. Farmers still planted and harvested, children still laughed beside the river's edge. The grandeur of Pharaoh was dazzling, but it rested always upon the steady rhythm of countless hands unseen. Egypt thrived because both palace and village, both temple and field, moved together in fragile, intricate balance. A balance that could be broken with surprising ease. Religion was the breath Egypt inhaled with every dawn. It was not a separate sphere, not something tucked away into temples and rituals. It was the current beneath every action, from the drawing of water to the laying of stone. To wake and to see the sun climb over the desert horizon was itself a prayer answered. For the Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, had once again defeated the forces of darkness during the perilous night. Each morning, when that first golden light touched the Nile, it was proof that the cosmos remained in order. Without Ra's triumph, the world would sink into chaos, and so his rising was met with gratitude and silence, or song. The temples, colossal in their presence, stood as anchors to this divine order. Their gates were painted in brilliant hues, their columns carved with hieroglyphs that told of gods and kings alike. To enter their shadow was to step into eternity. Priests rose before dawn, their bodies washed in cold water to purify them. They dressed in white linen, their heads shaved smooth, their movements deliberate. Within the temple's inner sanctum, where few ever entered, they tended to the statues of the gods as if they were living beings, bathing them, anointing them with oil, adorning them with fine garments and jewelry. Bread, beer, fruit, and meat were laid before the gods as offerings. And though the divine statues did not eat, the act itself kept the balance of Manat, the principle of cosmic order that governed heaven and earth alike. For the common Egyptian, religion was less formal, but no less binding. Amulets shaped like scarabs, eyes of Horus or Ankhs were carried close to the body. Mothers whispered protective prayers over children as they laid them to sleep. Farmers left small tokens in shrines near the fields, pleading for the floods to be generous. The gods were everywhere. In the river that nourished the land, in the desert winds that could wither crops, in the stars that wheeled over the night sky. To ignore them was to risk calamity. To honor them was to hope for survival. Death, too, was not an ending but a transformation. Egyptians lived with the afterlife ever present in their thoughts. Tombs were not mere resting places, but carefully prepared gateways to eternity. Even the humblest family might bury their dead with tokens: a loaf of bread, a jar of beer, a few words written on papyrus if they could afford it. For the wealthy, and most of all for Pharaoh, the preparations were far grander. Entire tombs were carved into the rock, filled with treasures, food, furniture, and even Shabti figurines meant to serve the deceased in the next world. The journey after death was seen as perilous, a passage through trials and dangers, as the heart of the dead would be weighed against the feather of Mot. And if it proved heavier, burdened by sin or selfishness, it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit. But if it balanced true, the soul would walk into the fields of reeds, a paradise where the Nile never failed and the harvest was eternal. Such beliefs wove themselves into daily life with a quiet inevitability. To speak honestly, to treat others with fairness, to uphold Mahath, these were not merely virtues, but necessities for one's eternal fate. Children learned them as naturally as they learned to swim in the Nile's waters. Still, fear lingered beneath the reverence. The unknown after death pressed upon the living, a shadow that even the brightest festivals could not erase. This was why tombs grew so vast, why texts like the Book of the Dead were copied so carefully. The Egyptians prepared for death not with despair, but with diligence, as if stocking provisions for a long journey. Pharaoh embodied this faith on the grandest scale. His very reign was a performance of divinity. When he stood in temple courts and offered sacrifices, when he joined priests in processions, he was not only a king, but a conduit between earth and heaven. Every stone lifted into place for a pyramid, every temple wall carved with his image, reinforced the bond between himself and the gods, for the people. To see Pharaoh kneeling before Ra or Osiris was to be reassured that the world remained steady, that Marat endured another day. Festivals tied these threads together, moments when religion spilled into the streets with joyous abundance. During the festival of Opet, for example, statues of the gods were carried from temple to temple, borne on gilded barges along the Nile. Crowds gathered along the banks, cheering, singing, clapping as the divine images passed. Wine flowed freely, Music rose into the air. And for those days, the boundary between mortal and divine thinned. Children gaped in wonder, elders closed their eyes in reverence, and even the humblest farmer felt part of the cosmic cycle. Yet beneath the grandeur and faith, there were quiet doubts, spoken only in whispers. Did the gods hear every prayer? Why did some crops fail, even when offerings were plentiful? Why did some children fall ill while others thrived? These questions lingered like sand caught in sandals, irritating, persistent, never fully answered. And still, the rituals continued, for to abandon them was to invite chaos, a danger no Egyptian dared. Like the rhythm of religion, like the rhythm of the Nile, bound Egypt together. It was the pulse beneath their art, their politics, their lives. To speak of Egypt without its gods would be to speak of a body without a heartbeat. The temple shadows stretched across villages. The priestly chants echoed in minds long after the ceremonies ended. And always in the background the people knew. The afterlife awaited, vast and uncertain, promising fields of plenty for the righteous and oblivion for the unworthy. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often imagine the pyramids rising out of the desert, their sharp edges cutting against the sky like blades of stone. But behind every towering monument stood thousands of men whose names history rarely recorded. These builders, laborers, and craftsmen carried the weight of Pharaoh's eternity on their backs. One limestone block at a time. Their lives were not gilded with gold or cloaked in divine authority. They were woven into the very bones of Egypt. Contrary to the old myths, the pyramids were not built by slaves chained in misery. Archaeology reveals something more complex, more human. Entire villages grew up beside the great construction sites. Rows of mud brick houses, bakeries, breweries, workshops, and infirmaries served the needs of workers and their families. Men worked in rotating crews, sometimes spending months at a time at the site before returning to their farms. They were fed with bread, onions, fish, and bira, diets sturdy enough to keep muscles moving under the sun. To walk among them would have been to see sweat shimmering on bare backs, hear the rhythmic thud of mallets against copper chisels, smell dust rising as stone cracked and split. Teams hauled blocks on sledges dragged across sand, water poured in front of the runners to reduce friction. Songs timed their movements, chants rising like a drumbeat of voices to keep pace steady. Heave, pull, their throats would strain. Blending labor with music, pain with rhythm, was work that carved not only stone, but the measure of lives. Injuries were common. Slip of a chisel, a stone dropped on a foot, a fall from scaffolding. Yet there were physicians to treat wounds, bones that show signs of careful setting, workers who healed enough to return. The state invested in their well-being not from generosity alone, but because each man was a piece of Pharaoh's eternity. To lose too many would be to lose progress, toward a tomb that had to be finished before death claimed the king. Among them were craftsmen whose skill still humbles us. Stone carvers etched hieroglyphs with astonishing precision. Painters brushed walls with figures of gods and stars. Carpenters shaped wooden sledges strong enough to bear ton upon ton. Their hands were rough, calloused, stained, yet what they created glowed with refinement. A man might spend his whole life chiseling, carving, painting, never to see his own name remembered, yet his work would outlast empires. And what did they think as they labored? Did they believe, as the priests taught, their work ensured Pharaoh's passage to the afterlife and preserved Manat for all Egypt? Some surely did. Faith was woven into every grain of their bread. But others perhaps muttered under their breath as their shoulders ached, wondering why the gods demanded so much sweat from mortal men. Still, they worked, because to work was to belong, and belonging was a currency stronger than silver. In the evenings, after the heat bled out of the day, the workers' village came alive. Fires flickered. The smell of roasting fish drifted through the air. Laughter rang as men drank their allotted beer. Children darted between huts. Women kneaded dough. Voices told stories of gods and spirits, of crocodiles lurking in the Nile. Some men sang, some fell silent in exhaustion, others clutched amulets and whispered prayers for strength to face another sunrise of toil. What is remarkable is how organized it all was. Foremen kept records, tallying rations and labor schedules. Scribes noted the names of crews and scribed graffiti boasting of their work. The drunkards of Menkar, one team proudly called themselves, leaving behind their cheeky mark on stone. Even in eternity's shadow, humor survived. Proof that these men were not faceless tools, but individuals with pride, rivalry, and camaraderie. The scale of their task, though, was beyond any one man. Imagine standing at the base of a pyramid under construction, a mountain of rising stone. The sound of hammers ringing like endless bells, dust thick enough to choke the throat. The sky above the desert burned, yet the pyramid rose steadily, inch by inch, block by block. Toward a perfection no single life could achieve, but generations could. And through it all, Pharaoh loomed, not always physically present, but as an idea, a weight pressing as heavily as the stones themselves. For Pharaoh was not just a ruler, he was eternity embodied, and his tomb was not simply a grave, but a cosmic machine. A promise that he would rise again with Ra and keep Mot secure. To labor on such a structure was to be bound, willingly or not, into Egypt's vision of forever. When death came for these workers, they were buried not in grand tombs, but in simple graves near the site. Yet some were laid to rest with jars of beer, bread, and amletza, quiet echo of the very practices they helped enshrine for Pharaoh. In their modest way, they too prepared for the afterlife, perhaps comforted by the thought that their sweat had built monuments that reached the heavens. The pyramids stand still, mute but eloquent. They tell us of Pharaoh's ambition, of course, but also of the countless hands that lifted, carved, hauled, and dreamed in their shadows. Each block whispers of backs bent, of songs sung, of laughter after work, of lives lived in service of something greater than themselves. And though their names are lost, their labor endures in stone, defying time, reminding us that history is built not only by kings, but by the many who toiled unseen beneath them. When the sun slipped low behind the desert horizon and the last echoes of chisels faded into quiet, the workers' villages stirred with a different kind of life. Here, beyond the thunder of stone against stone, ordinary rhythms, pulsed families, meals, gossip, laughter, and the fragile comforts that softened the edge of relentless labor. Each village was a world of its own, built of mud brick walls that glowed orange in the evening light, narrow lanes twisted between rows of modest homes. The air carried the smell of fresh bread pulled from dome-shaped ovens, mingling with the earthy scent of clay and the faint temps of sweat that clung to men returning from the quarries. In these homes, space was simple but sufficient. A hearth, a few mats of woven reeds, clay jars of beer and water, small niches in the walls where amulets hung. The hum of conversation rose as families reunited. Children raced barefoot across the dust, their laughter bright against the gathering dusk. Women kneaded dough, their hands working rhythmically as they shaped loaves to bake for the next day's rations. Some brewed beer, thick and cloudy, poured into jars that would serve both as nourishment and as a balm against weariness.
Ow!
Meals were humble but sustaining. Bread dipped in lentil stew, dried fish, caught from the Nile, onions and garlic ground into sauces. Occasionally, a family might taste meat, though that was rare, saved for festivals or as reward from overseers. But hunger was not constant. The state ensured rations, for a hungry workforce would falter, and Pharaoh's tomb could not wait. As men sat cross-legged on mats, Their conversations flickered between pride and complaint. The drunkards of Menkau, or one crew called themselves, their banter laced with boasts about the day's progress. Another man might grumble about a sore shoulder, only to laugh when his friend mocked him for weakness. Humor was as necessary as bread, carrying them through aches and fatigue. Graffiti etched into stone walls tells us their voices were never silent. They carved their crew names into blocks destined for eternity, scribbled jokes, even drew crude figures. In these playful scratches, we glimpse their humanity, their refusal to be forgotten, even as Pharaoh's name loomed above theirs. Beyond food and laughter, there were rituals that stitched life together. In the evenings, women and men alike touched small amulets shaped as scarabs, ankhs, or protective eyes, whispering prayers for health, strength, and safety. They knew that death could come suddenly, a slip beneath a heavy block, an illness carried by the river, a snake in the sand. Faith was a shield against the unknown. Festivals were the moments when life spilled beyond mere survival. When a holy day came, the village pulsed with energy. Music rose, played on flutes and drums. Voices sang hymns to Hathor, Sekhmet, or Osiris. Beer flowed more freely, and men danced in circles, sweat glistening under torchlight, their joy for once unshackled from stone. Women painted their eyes with kohl, children clutched flowers woven into crowns, and the harsh edge of the desert softened into celebration. These festivals tied the workers to the very cosmos they labored for. They were not just building tombs, they were affirming the divine order of Ma'at. Each celebration was a reminder that their toil mattered, that it was not simply sweat in the sand, but service to gods and Pharaoh alike. At night, when torches guttered out and shadows thickened, the village quieted. Families lay down on reed mats, the cool of the desert night seeping through the mud brick walls. Sleep came easily to the exhausted, but dreams were not always peaceful. Some whispered of nightmares, visions of the desert swallowing them, of gods weighing their hearts. Others dreamed of home, of farms left behind, of wives and children waiting. Stars overhead glittered like shards of eternity, and in their stillness, the workers found both comfort and unease. Within this life of routine and hardship, bonds of community were strong. Neighbors helped one another. If a man fell ill, others shared food. If a woman needed water, children ran to the well. Scribes recorded disputes, settling quarrels before they grew dangerous. The village was small, but it was bound by necessity, and necessity forged kinship. Still, cracks existed. Overseers enforced discipline, sometimes harshly. Whips could lash, punishments could fall, though records show that workers also had the power to protest. Some refused to work until rations were delivered, leaving behind one of the world's earliest labor strikes. Their voices, though quiet in history, remind us that even in Pharaoh's shadow, men sought fairness. The Nile itself was the lifeline threading through this existence. From it came fish, water, reeds, and the fertile fields that sustained their families. Workers' wives might walk to its banks, balancing jars on their heads as they filled them with water. Children splashed in its shallows, their laughter carrying over the current. While fishermen cast nets with patience born of generations, the river gave life, but it also reminded them of time's rhythm, the annual flood that renewed the land, just as each sunrise renewed their labor. When sickness struck, the infirmary offered what care it could. Bones were set, wounds cleaned, herbs applied. Evidence of healed fractures shows that men were valued enough to be treated, not discarded. The state's investment in their survival was practical, but in that practicality lay a recognition. Each man was more than a tool. He was essential to Pharaoh's eternity. And when death came, as it inevitably did, the workers were not cast aside. Burials have been found near the pyramids, graves simple but tender. In the heart of the palace, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and lotus oil, the pharaoh began his day long before the first farmers had stirred along the Nile. His life was bound not to the rhythm of the sun or the soil, but to the eternal weight of Matat, the divine order he was sworn to uphold. Each morning was a ceremony, not merely a routine. As dawn's first light pierced through carved windows, priests approached him in silence, carrying vessels of perfumed water. His body was washed, his skin anointed with sacred oils, his eyes painted with kohl, not only for beauty but for protection. To the priests, every gesture was cosmic. Pharaoh's body was no ordinary flesh, but the living form of Horus, the falcon god who saw all from the sky. Even the sandals laid at his feet were blessed before touching his skin, as though the ground itself must be made worthy to carry him. The crown, too, was no simple ornament. Some days it was the white crown of Upper Egypt, tall and conical, gleaming against his dark hair. Other days the red crown of Lower Egypt, flat and broad, heavy with symbolism. And sometimes both were joined together into the double crown, the Phent, a visible reminder that he was lord of two lands. The weight of that crown was not only physical, but spiritual. Beneath it, Pharaoh bore the struggles of his people, their harvests, their wars, their hopes for eternity. After the rituals of adornment came offerings. Priests presented trays of bread, beer, figs, and incense, their chants rising like smoke toward the gods. Pharaoh accepted these as if he himself were a god. But he also offered them onward, becoming the bridge between mortal and divine. The halls echoed with hymns, the rhythmic clapping of hands, the ringing of sistrums that shimmered like sunlight over water. Outside the palace, crowds gathered just to glimpse him as he stepped into the courtyard. To see Pharaoh was to see eternity embodied. His presence was said to bless the eyes, his words to carry divine authority. When he raised his hand in a gesture of blessing, it was as though the Nile itself had promised another flood, the gods, another season of life. Yet beyond the spectacle there was burden. For all the grandeur, Pharaoh's days were filled with decisions that would ripple through the land. Scribes unrolled papyrus scrolls filled with reports, grain counts, tax collections, lists of temple offerings. Messengers came from distant provinces, their sandals worn thin from the desert road, bringing news of disputes, rebellions, or drought. Each matter demanded his judgment, and his judgment was final. In council, advisors bent low, their voices hushed, careful not to speak more boldly than the ruler himself. Pharaoh's silence could stretch long, heavy as stone, while he considered. To some it was wisdom, to others, a reminder that his voice was not that of a man, but of the gods themselves. When he spoke, scribes captured every word, for a decree once uttered was as enduring as carved granite. And yet, Pharaoh was still human beneath the titles. He grew weary. He quarreled with his family. He knew jealousy, ambition, and fear. Behind the closed doors of the harem, where wives and concubines lived, there were rivalries as sharp as blades. Queens sought influence for their sons. Whispers carried through silk curtains, alliances and enmities shifting like desert winds. To be pharaoh was to live not only in the gaze of the gods, but also under the watchful eyes of one's own household. Meals in the palace were feasts of richness, yet they too were ritual. Tables groaned with roasted fowl, honey cakes, bowls of dates and figs, fish fresh from the Nile, beef and lamb seasoned with coriander and cumin, and wine poured into alabaster cups gleamed in the torchlight. Musicians played harps and flutes, dancers moved with grace, and laughter could fill the halls. But often Pharaoh ate with measured dignity, the feast less about indulgence and more about the reminder of abundances. abundance that set him apart from the common man who lived on bread, onions, and beer. At night, when the palace grew still, Pharaoh sometimes walked alone through colonnaded halls. The pillars rose like a forest of stone, carved with scenes of gods offering him life, eternity, and power. Torches flickered, shadows leapt across painted walls, and the echo of his sandals rang in the vast silence. In those moments, perhaps he felt the solitude that no crown could shield him from the knowledge that all eyes depended on him, that his mistakes could ripple into famine, his victories into prosperity. Sleep came in chambers thick with incense, guarded by soldiers, attended by servants. His bed was carved of cedar, his sheets woven linen, his dreams heavy with omens. Priests would interpret them at dawn, seeking hints of divine favor or warning. A dream of falcons could mean victory, a dream of crocodiles, danger in the river. Even in sleep, Pharaoh was never free of his role. He was both man and God, both father of children and father of a nation, both mortal flesh and eternal soul. And always the awareness lingered. The tomb was being built even as he breathed, stone by stone, chamber by chamber. Each sunrise was not only a new day, but one step closer to the moment when his Ka would depart, when all the rituals and monuments must prove strong enough to preserve him forever. Thus, the rhythm of Pharaoh's life was not simply grandeur, but a dance between divinity and humanity. To the people, he was the embodiment of gods, a figure of awe and reverence. To himself, he was also a man of flesh, carrying loneliness, ambition, and the ever-present shadow of death. And yet, he bore it with the stillness of stone, for stone was what would remain when breath had long ceased. Beyond the incense and rituals of the palace, there was another side to Pharaoh's reign, one that involved dust, steel, and the cries of men on the battlefield. The Nile gave Egypt its strength, but the world beyond its fertile banks was not always kind. To the east stretched deserts that led to rival kingdoms. To the south, Nubian lands rich in gold and ebony beckoned. To the north, the Mediterranean opened paths to trade, but also threats. Pharaoh was more than a ruler of farmers and temples. He was commander of armies, defender of borders, and the living shield between his people and chaos. The call to war was no small affair. Before any campaign, priests consulted the gods. They read the flight of birds, the patterns of stars, the dreams of Pharaoh himself. If omens were favorable, the army gathered. Soldiers were not all full-time warriors. Many were farmers, called upon to trade their plows for spears during the season when the Nile flooded and fields could not be tilled. Others were professionals, hardened men who had fought in multiple campaigns, wielding bows, axes, or curved Coppish swords. They trained in drills, marched in formation, and carried shields of wood and leather painted with divine symbols. Alongside them came charioteers, the pride of Egypt's military. Swift horses pulled light chariots across open plains, their wheels humming like thunder. Their riders armed with bows that rained arrows on enemies from a distance. Pharaoh himself often rode at the head of such a chariot, his presence more than symbolic. To see the king leading was to believe the gods themselves fought beside them. His image, carved on temple walls, always showed him victorious. Enemies crushed beneath his wheels, chaos subdued by order. But real battles were not as flawless as stone reliefs suggested. Dust choked the air, men screamed in fear as much as fury, and the clash of bronze against bronze was messy and uncertain. Even Pharaoh, shielded by elite guards, felt the sting of risk. Arrows did not discriminate between king and soldier. Each campaign carried the weight not only of victory, but of survival. When not at war, Pharaoh turned to diplomacy. Messengers traveled across deserts, carrying clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform, the language of diplomacy in the region. These tablets recorded letters exchanged with kings and rulers from faraway lands Babylonia, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni. They spoke of alliances, marriages, demands for gold, pleas for grain during famine. In these exchanges, Pharaoh was not only warrior but negotiator, his prestige measured in gifts as much as in battles. Sometimes diplomacy came in the form of royal marriages. A princess from a foreign land might be wed to Pharaoh, sealing peace between nations. Such unions brought not only political security, but also luxury and new goods, exotic animals, foreign customs that mingled with Egyptian life. Yet diplomacy was fragile. One insult, one broken promise, could undo years of negotiation. Within the palace walls, scribes bent over their desks, translating messages, recording treaties, drafting replies. Pharaoh's words traveled hundreds of miles, carried by couriers through heat and danger, words that could start or stop a war. To his people, Pharaoh's victories were celebrated in grand processions. Triumphal returns brought captured enemies in chains, their treasures laid at the feet of temples, their leaders bowing before Egypt's might. Citizens lined the streets cheering as musicians played and incense burned. Inscriptions carved the victories into eternity, ensuring that long after Pharaoh's bones had turned to dust, the story of his triumphs would remain sharp in stone. But for the men who fought, the return was less glorious. Many came back scarred, limping, or not at all. Families wept for husbands and sons who never returned. The spoils of war fed temples and palaces, but it was the farmers and commoners who paid the deeper price in blood. This balanced glory for the few, sacrifice for the many was part of the silent truth behind the shining image of Pharaoh as eternal victor. Military might also kept order within Egypt itself. Governors of distant provinces sometimes grew too ambitious, priests too powerful, nobles too independent. An army loyal to Pharaoh ensured that no one within the kingdom forgot who held ultimate power. Even the sight of soldiers marching through the streets of Thebes or Memphis was a reminder that divine order was backed by steel and discipline. At night, when war drums were silent and the stars stretched across the desert sky, Pharaoh sat in his palace and considered the map spread before him. Lines drawn in ink represented rivers, towns, enemies. Tiny figurines marked chariots and fortresses. Each decision to move them meant lives lost or spared. The gods may have been consulted, but it was Pharaoh's hand that directed the course of armies. Pharaoh's will that decided whether peace or war would come. And beneath the weight of crowns and victories was the knowledge that enemies never disappeared completely. Defeated today, they could rise again tomorrow. Egypt's greatness was not a gift, but a constant struggle, one that demanded vigilance and strength from its ruler. To the people who plowed the fields, Pharaoh's wars might have seemed distant, stories told in marketplaces or painted on temple walls. But their effects were not distant at all. Victories brought new wealth, trade routes, and security. Defeats threatened famine, invasions, or uprisings. Thus, the life of every farmer, builder, fisherman was tied invisibly to Pharaoh's choices on battlefields far from their villages. In this way, war and diplomacy were not separate from daily life, but threads woven into the very fabric of Egypt's survival. So Pharaoh lived not only as priest, god, and judge, but as general and diplomat, a man who bore in his hands both the spear and the olive branch. His reign was not measured only in monuments and temples, but in the unseen ripple of every treaty signed, every arrow loosed, every enemy subdued or appeased. This was the other side of the divine kingship, not statues and hymns, but blood, dust, and fragile peace held together by the will of one man. For Pharaoh, life was never separate from death. From the moment he wore the double crown of Egypt, He carried not only the burden of ruling the living, but the duty of preparing for eternity. A tomb was not an afterthought built at the end of a reign. It was begun almost as soon as Pharaoh took the throne, every stone carved, every chamber painted. Every offering sealed was part of a lifelong project to ensure his place among the gods. Deep in the desert cliffs, away from the fertile Nile, neighbors cut into the rock to create the hidden chambers of the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the massive pyramids of earlier dynasties, these tombs sought secrecy as much as grandeur. Pharaoh's eternal house was to be concealed, hidden from thieves, guarded by curses carved into walls. The corridors wound deep into the earth, leading to a burial chamber where his sarcophagus would rest. Each detail of the tomb was overseen by scribes and architects. Measurements were exact, for the afterlife demanded precision. Artists painted the walls with scenes of gods, underworld journeys, and spells from the Book of the Dead. They were not decorations, but maps for Pharaoh's soul, guides that would help him face trials in the next world. Every color had meaning. Blue for water, green for rebirth, red for chaos to be defeated, gold, always gold, for the flesh of the gods. Outside the tomb, monumental temples rose along the Nile. These were not mere shrines, but living statements of Pharaoh's power. Massive pylons carved with reliefs showed him striking down enemies, receiving gifts from the gods, presiding over rituals that kept the world in balance. Obelisks, tall and narrow, pointed to the heavens, catching the sun's light at dawn and dusk. Symbols of the eternal connection between the ruler and Ra, the sun god. To build such wonders required armies of workers, stonecutters, masons, carpenters, painters, were skilled artisans who passed their craft from father to son, living in special villages like Deir el-Medina, where their lives were structured around the building of tombs. Others were laborers summoned from farms, working in shifts, fed with bread, beer, and onions. Sweating under the relentless sun as they dragged blocks of limestone with ropes and wooden sledges, overseers shouted, whips cracked, songs were sung to keep rhythm. The desert rang with the sound of hammers and chisels. Yet behind this labor was a belief shared by Pharaoh and workers alike, that these monuments were not only for one man, but for the stability of Egypt itself. By ensuring Pharaoh's eternity, they ensured the Nile would rise, the sun would return, the cycle of life would continue. Within the palace, treasures were prepared to accompany Pharaoh into his tomb. Chests of gold, alabaster jars filled with perfumes, amulets carved in the shapes of sacred symbols. Miniature models of servants and soldiers were crafted, so that in the afterlife, Pharaoh would not lack for labor. Even furniture was built, beds of ebony, chairs inlaid with ivory, to provide comfort in eternity. These were not symbolic alone, they were practical, because Egyptians believed the afterlife mirrored life. Pharaoh would eat, drink, rule, and rest, just as he had in the living world, only in the eternal company of the gods. Priests oversaw the ritual side of this preparation. They recited hymns, purified objects, and ensured every spell inscribed on the tomb walls was correct. A single mistake in a hieroglyph could disrupt the journey of Pharaoh's soul. Accuracy was sacred, night after night, by the flickering glow of oil lamps. Scribes dipped their brushes in ink and wrote prayers that would outlast their own lives, prayers carved into eternity. For the Pharaoh himself, visiting the construction of his tomb was both pride and reminder. Walking through unfinished chambers, he saw his own mortality carved in stone. Though he was hailed as a god on earth, the work of the tomb whispered to him that one day flesh would fall away, and what mattered was whether his soul endured. Yet in this reminder lay also his greatest promise, that death was not an end, but a transition. The tomb was not a place of sorrow, but of passage, a doorway to eternal kingship. Common Egyptians knew of these preparations in fragments. They saw the temples rise, heard stories of treasures sealed away, but only a few ever glimpsed the secret work inside Pharaoh's eternal house. To them, the sight of obelisks reaching the sky or temple walls painted with victories was enough. These monuments reassured them that Pharaoh would not only protect them in life, but intercede for them in death, keeping balance between the seen and unseen worlds. Yet not all who labored shared in this comfort. Workers often knew the location of tombs, the wealth stored within, and some whispered of robbing them once Pharaoh was gone. Curses were written into walls to terrify such intruders. Promises of blindness, madness, or death to any who disturbed the resting king. Still, centuries later, many tombs were plundered, treasures lost, mummies desecrated. But while thieves could steal gold, they could not erase the power carved into stone, nor the eternal memory of Pharaoh as ruler in both worlds. And so, even as he lived, Pharaoh's mind stretched into eternity. Each block placed, each inscription finished, was another step toward ensuring his immortality. His monuments were not vanity, but duty. They tied his reign to the divine cycle, promising that Egypt would endure as long as his name was remembered. In the golden light of sunset, when the Nile shimmered like liquid fire and the temple pylons cast long shadows, Pharaoh stood at the heart of this vast effort. To his people, he was the bridge between heaven and earth. To himself, he was a man building a path toward forever. The tomb, the temples, the statues, they were not separate from life, but part of the same unbroken journey. Death was not the end. It was the horizon. In the courts of Egypt's grand temples, power moved in whispers as much as in rituals. The priests, robed in white linen, shaved clean of hair. Lives ruled by purity and ritual, for they were the intermediaries between gods and men. Pharaoh was the high priest of every temple in name. But in practice, it was these men who carried out the endless cycle of offerings, prayers, and ceremonies that kept Egypt's world in balance. At dawn, when the first rays of the sun touched the temple pylons, the high priest would lead a procession into the inner sanctum. The temple itself was a world in miniature, its walls carved with images of creation, its columns painted to resemble papyrus and lotus. The plants of the Nile, passing through the darkened halls, was a journey back into the moment of creation. From chaos into order, until at last they reached the shrine where the god dwelled in statue form. The doors of the shrine were opened only by priests. There, in the flicker of oil lamps, they washed the statue, anointed it with oils, and dressed it in fresh linen as though it were a living king. Offerings of bread, beer, meat, fruit, and incense were laid before it. Hymns were sung, the scent of burning myrrh filled the air, and with each gesture, Egypt's world was renewed. For ordinary people, temples were places of awe, but also of distance. Few ever saw the innermost rooms where the gods resided. They prayed in outer courtyards, left small offerings, or joined festivals when the goddess statue was carried out on a golden bark to sail along the Nile. These moments, rare and dazzling, allowed the people to feel the presence of their gods, even if only for a day. Yet behind the sanctity was a machinery of power. The temples were not only spiritual centers, but economic engines. They owned vast lands, herds of cattle, workshops of artisans, fleets of boats. Farmers toiled on temple estates, their grain-filling storehouses whose surpluses gave priests wealth to rival nobles. Scribes tallied every offering, every payment, every shipment of goods flowing into the temple's domain. For the pharaoh, this was both strength and danger. On one hand, the priesthood sustained his legitimacy, performing rituals that proclaimed him chosen by the gods. On the other, their growing wealth and influence made them a power of their own. A strong pharaoh kept them in check, balancing temple riches against royal authority. A weak one risked becoming overshadowed by the very priests who were meant to serve him. The daily rituals themselves were meticulous. Each movement had meaning, each chant a weight. Priests fasted, bathed multiple times a day, avoided certain foods to keep themselves pure. They believed that if any step was neglected, chaos could creep in, endangering the order of Mat that kept Egypt alive. Even their tools were symbolic. Incense to purify, sistrums to call joy, sacred oils to strengthen the god statue. To the priests, they were not actors, but participants in a cosmic drama that had begun at creation and would never end. During great festivals, the barriers between ordinary people and gods softened. The Opet festival in Thebes, for example, saw the statue of Amun carried from Karnak to Luxor along the Nile, cheered by crowds accompanied by music, dancers, and feasting. These processions reinforced the bond between Pharaoh, God, and people, reminding all that divine order flowed through every part of Egypt's life. Priests presided over such events, but they also blended into them, part of the great pageant that unified the land. Yet for all their public presence, the lives of priests were bound by strict rules. Many lived within temple complexes, their days consumed by ritual, study, and administration. They were keepers of sacred knowledge. Astronomy to track the stars, medicine learned from centuries of practice. Mathematics needed to build and align temples with celestial patterns. Their wisdom made them indispensable, but also enigmatic, figures who seemed to stand slightly apart from ordinary life. Among the most powerful were the high priests of Amun at Thebes. In some periods, their influence grew so great that they controlled armies, lands, and wealth rivaling Pharaoh himself. In times of weak kings, they were Egypt's true rulers in all but name. In times of strong kings, they served as pillars of stability, anchoring the throne with divine authority. The priests also oversaw funerary rituals for nobles and commoners alike. They were guardians of the Book of the Dead, reciting spells, guiding souls through the trials of the underworld. Their chants at funerals were more than comfort. They were believed to be bridges carrying the deceased safely to the next life. Every coffin, every amulet, every word of prayer was part of a vast system of belief in which priests were the essential mediators. And yet, for all their solemnity, priests were still human. Stories whispered of corruption, of offerings diverted, of priests who grew fat on temple wealth while peasants struggled. Satirical writings mocked them as pompous or greedy. But even these criticisms showed how central priests were to Egyptian life. To mock them was to acknowledge their power, to resent their hold while still depending on their rituals. In Pharaoh's court, priests were advisors as much as servants of the gods. They read omens in the stars, interpreted dreams, guided when to plant, when to wage war, when to hold festivals. Their voices were soft, but their influence was immense, shaping decisions that touched every Egyptian. The pharaoh could command armies, but he needed the priests to command the unseen. At night, when the temples stood silent and the statues rested in their shrines, priests looked to the heavens. The Milky Way stretched like a river across the sky, mirrored by the Nile below. Stars marked the passage of time, guiding both farmer and king. Priests charted them carefully, for in the heavens lay the same order they sought to preserve on earth. To them, each rising star was another reminder that Mat endured, that the rituals had meaning. And so, in shadow and flame, chant and silence, the priests upheld Egypt's great balance. Their lives were hidden from most, their wealth envied, their power sometimes feared. But without them, the link between Pharaoh, gods, and people would falter. In their daily washing of statues, in their precise words of prayer, they renewed the universe itself. The heartbeat of Egypt was not in its temples or palaces, but in the rhythm of the fields. In the endless stretch of farmland watered by the Nile, every year the river rose and fell with the seasons. Every year the farmers lived in step with its moods. The Nile's flooding was not seen as disaster, but as renewal. The river bringing black silt from far to the south and laying it down across the floodplain, turning the land fertile again. When the waters receded, the fields shone dark and wet, ready for planting. This was the calendar that mattered most. More than any royal decree, the river's rise determined whether Egypt would prosper or starve. Most farmers lived in small mud brick houses along the edge of fields, clustered into villages where everyone knew one another. Their lives were hard, shaped by labor, yet they formed the foundation of all Egypt's glory. Men tilled the soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen, women tended vegetable gardens or baked bread in clay ovens. Children helped scare away birds or carried water in clay jars. Life was work, but it was also community, laughter, and survival shared together. The tools were simple, the methods unchanged for centuries. Yet with the Nile's gift, they produced enough to feed millions and fuel the state's ambitions. The yearly cycle began with the inundation, when waters spread across the land and fields lay submerged. During this time, many farmers turned to other work. Some were conscripted to labor on great projects, digging canals, hauling stones, serving on royal expeditions. Others repaired tools, built boats, or worked in workshops producing goods for local use or for trade. When the waters withdrew, life became a frenzy of planting. Wheat, barley, flax, vegetables, and fruit trees all depended on careful timing. Everyone joined in planting by hand, driving animals to trample seeds into the mud, setting irrigation channels to guide precious water. Then came the wait, days measured in chores, stories told under the sun, offerings given to the gods for good harvests. Harvest was both a joy and a trial. Men cut stalks with sickles of wood and set with sharp flints. Women bound them into bundles. Children carried grain to threshing floors where oxen trampled it free from husks, the air filled with dust, sweat, and the sound of voices shouting instructions. Then came winnowing, tossing grain into the air so the chaff blew away in the breeze, leaving kernels to be stored in great baskets or sealed jars. A portion always went to the state as tax, collected by scribes and overseers who measured carefully, ensuring Pharaoh's granaries remained full. Sometimes taxes felt heavy, leaving families with just enough to scrape through until the next season. Yet it was this system that built the temples, fed the workers, and sustained the army. Daily meals were simple, but sustaining. Bread was the staple, coarse and sometimes gritty with bits of stone from the grinding of grain. Beer, thick and nourishing, was drunk by all. On good days, there might be fish from the river, vegetables from gardens, or meat from small animals raised at home. Families gathered on mats in their small courtyards, eating together, sharing talk of the day's work, watching children play. Life was not grand, but it was steady, and that steadiness was its strength. Festivals were bright breaks in the year. Even the poorest farmer could take joy in music, dance, and feasting when the gods' statues were carried out, when neighbors joined in celebrations under colorful banners. At such times, songs filled the air. Drums and flutes echoed across the villages. And for a while, the burdens of tax and toil felt lighter. These were moments of unity, reminding farmers they were part of something larger, a land held together by the Nile and by Pharaoh's rule. Still, hardships were never far. Low flood could bring hunger, a high one destruction. Disease sometimes swept through villages. Work in the fields bent backs and wore down bodies. Life expectancy was not long, though people found joy where they could in family and song, in the certainty that their work had meaning. They believed the gods watched over their efforts, that the harvest was as much a gift from divine favor as from human labor. For Pharaoh, farmers were the invisible army behind his power. Without them, temples would have no offerings, armies no supplies, nobles no wealth. The grandeur of pyramids and palaces rested on the shoulders of men and women who rose with the sun and bent their hands to the soil. In art, they were shown in long rows, harvesting, plowing, carrying baskets, a silent acknowledgement that they were Egypt's lifeblood. Their names may be lost, but their labor endured in every stone, every song, every prayer that Egypt ever raised. At night, villages were quiet. Oil lamps glowed in doorways, stars spread across the sky. Families lay on reed mats, listening to the distant call of frogs and insects, the faint lap of the Nile against its banks. Dreams were filled with both hopes and fears of plentiful harvests, of floods gone wrong, of gods who might bless or curse. And yet, come dawn, the work began again, as it always had, as it always would. Egypt's farmers, nameless yet essential, kept the wheel of life turning beneath the grandeur of pharaohs and the solemnity of priests. If the farmers gave Egypt its food, the artisans gave it its face. They were the ones who turned mud and stone into palaces, temples, and tombs, who shaped the visions of pharaohs into lasting monuments. Their world was different from that of farmers, though equally demanding. Many lived in special communities, such as the famous village of Deir el-Medina near Thebes, home to the men who carved and painted the Valley of the Kings. There, behind guarded walls, entire families lived in houses provided by the state, their lives tied to the labor of building eternal resting places for their rulers. The artisans' days were long and meticulous. Stonecutters rose with the dawn, their bodies already marked by years of swinging chisels and hauling rock. With copper or bronze tools, sometimes reinforced with harder stones, they chipped away at limestone and sandstone, cutting corridors deep into the earth. Dust clung to their skin, and the air in the tomb tunnels grew thick and stifling. Torchlight flickered on walls that would one day be covered in images of gods and kings. But for the workers, it was simply another day of sweat and precision. Painters and sculptors followed. They sketched outlines in red ochre before masters corrected them in black. Carvers then chiseled the shapes into walls, rows of gods, hieroglyphic prayers. Scenes of Pharaoh smiting enemies or sailing with the sun god Ra. Painters added color. Deep blues, vibrant reds, greens made from ground malachite. Even in the dim light of tomb corridors, the scenes came alive, designed to guide Pharaoh into eternity. Every brushstroke was both art and ritual, a work meant not for living eyes, but for the afterlife. Their labor was steady, but dangerous. Tombs collapsed, dust sickened lungs, accidents maimed, yet they were valued in ways farmers often were not. Artisans were paid in kind. Rations of bread, beer, vegetables, sometimes meat. They had homes, rights, even the ability to strike if their wages were delayed at rarity in the ancient world. Records survive of such strikes, where workers laid down tools and demanded their rations from officials, proving their importance to Egypt's machine of eternity. Life in Deir el-Medina and similar villages was close-knit. Families lived side by side, gossiping, sharing meals, borrowing tools. Children grew up learning their parents' skills, tracing figures in the sand before one day wielding chisels and brushes themselves. Women played vital roles too, managing households, weaving linen, preparing food, sometimes even taking part in small-scale crafts. Festivals brought music and joy, while shared hardships built solidarity. Yet artisans were also keepers of secrets. They knew the hidden corridors of tombs, the treasures buried with kings, the magic words painted on walls. To betray these secrets was unthinkable, punishable by death. Even so, tales of tomb robbing suggest that in times of famine or political weakness, some among them may have risked everything to steal from the very monuments they built.
Oh,
Their work left behind not only splendor, but humanity. In the workers' village, Astrakosh arts of pottery recorded jokes, love notes, shopping lists, even drawings mocking their bosses or depicting animals acting like people. These fragments, humble but vivid, show the artisans as real, breathing individuals, not just hands behind stone. They laughed, they quarreled, they dreamed, even as they built the eternal visions of others. To Pharaoh and priests, artisans were tools of divine will, shaping monuments that glorified gods and rulers. To themselves, they were craftsmen, proud of their skill, aware that their work would outlast them. Every carved figure, every painted star on a tomb ceiling was both labor and legacy. They worked not only for wages, but for a strange immortality, the knowledge that long after their names were forgotten, their hands would still be seen in every line etched into stone. At night, when the day's toil ended, artisans stepped out of their workshops to see the same stars the priests charted and the farmers prayed beneath. But perhaps they saw them differently. The artisans' stars were guides for their art, patterns they painted onto ceilings to mirror the heavens, symbols that would carry kings into the afterlife. For them, the sky was both inspiration and reminder that even stone, carved with all their skill, could only try to capture eternity. If artisans gave Pharaoh his monuments, it was the scribes who gave him his voice. They were the keepers of words and numbers, the men who transformed speech into symbols that would endure on papyrus, stone, or clay. In a land where most people could not read or write, scribes were set apart, a class both envied and respected. They read pens as powerful as swords. From boyhood, a future scribe's path was rigorous. Sons of officials or craftsmen might be sent to the House of Life, the temple schools where writing was taught. There they learned hieroglyphs, the sacred signs that adorned tombs and temples, as well as the quicker hieratic script used in daily work. Students copied texts endlessly, their fingers stained with ink made from soot and ochre. Mistakes brought punishment, for in Egypt, words were not mere marks, they carried divine power. To write a name was to give it life. To erase it was to condemn it to oblivion. A trained scribe could serve in countless ways. Some became administrators, tallying grain in state storehouses, recording the harvest of every field, ensuring that Pharaoh's taxes were paid. Others worked in the army, keeping track of supplies, PE, and troop numbers. Still others served in temples, inscribing hymns, copying sacred texts, or chronicling rituals. To Pharaoh himself, scribes were indispensable, drafting royal decrees, recording victories, chiseling his name into eternity. The daily tools of a scribe were simple but potent. A wooden palette held cakes of black and red ink. A reed pen was cut and sharpened for fine strokes. Papyrus scrolls rolled and tied with string. It carried the records of Egypt's life, from court cases to love poems, from astronomical charts to tax accounts. In their hands, the chaos of the world became order. Every transaction noted, every offering accounted for, every command preserved. Scribes lived with a prestige that few others enjoyed. They were freed from heavy labor in the fields or quarries, their skills shielding them from the hardships that weighed on farmers and artisans. Ancient texts celebrated their role, urging young men to pursue the scribe's life instead of breaking their backs with the plow. To hold a pen was to wield privilege. To live closer to the courts of power than to the mud of the Nile. But their work was not always grand. Many scribes spent long hours hunched over records, tallying numbers, copying contracts, writing letters for officials to busy or, too illiterate to do so themselves. A scribe might spend days in a storeroom, counting jars of beer, or at a construction site, noting how many blocks of stone were delivered. In these mundane details lay Egypt's stability. Without the scribe's order, Pharaoh's vast kingdom could not function. Beyond administration, scribes were also guardians of culture. They copied tales and hymns, medical texts, and instructions for living wisely. Thanks to them, stories, like the tale of Sinna or wisdom texts, like the maxims of Tehotep, survived, echoing across thousands of years. Through their steady hands, Egypt's memory was preserved, one brushstroke at a time. At night, a scribe might rest in his modest home, dining on bread, beer, perhaps a little meat if his wages were generous. He might read to his children, passing down stories that had once been copied in temple schools. His neighbors, farmers, laborers, artisans might look at him with a mixture of envy and respect, for though he did not wield the plow or the chisel, his pen connected him to Pharaoh himself. For Pharaoh, the scribe was both servant and shield. Victories were carved into stone by scribes. Defeats could be softened or erased by their discretion. A name written wrongly, a decree miscopied, could change lives. And so, though they seemed humble, scribes carried immense influence, shaping Egypt's past, present, and even its afterlife. For to inscribe a prayer on a coffin, or to write the words of a spell, was to guide a soul into eternity. To be a scribe was to straddle two worlds, the dusty reality of records and numbers, and the timeless realm of words that outlasted stone. They were not kings, nor warriors, nor priests, but Egypt could not have endured without them. Their ink, dark and unassuming, was the blood of an empire that stretched across centuries. Egypt was a land of fields, temples, and tombs, but it was also a kingdom that needed defending. Beyond the fertile ribbon of the Niles stretched deserts filled with raiders, and to the north, across the Sinai, foreign kingdoms watched with envious eyes. Soldiers were the shield of Pharaoh, protectors of order against chaos, wielding weapons forged in fire and discipline. For most of Egypt's history, the army was made not of professionals, but of ordinary men called up when Pharaoh demanded. Farmers left their plows, artisans left their workshops, and together they marched under banners of linen painted with falcons, cobras, or the sun disk of Ra. When the campaign ended, they returned to their villages, their lives resuming as if war were only an interruption. But in later times, as threats grew greater and Egypt's empire stretched farther, a standing army formed, men whose lives were spent in training, patrolling, and marching at Pharaoh's will. Training was rigorous. Young recruits drilled with bows and spears, learning to keep formation, to fight in unison rather than as scattered individuals. The bow was Egypt's favored weapon, its archers renowned across the ancient world. Spears and shields gave infantrymen strength in close combat, while axes and sickle swords, curved bronze blades, could bite through armor. Armor itself was rare, for Egypt's heat made heavy protection unbearable. Most soldiers fought bare-chested, wearing only leather straps or padded cloth, their defense resting more on skill and numbers than on iron. The army also carried chariots. Egypt's pride in the age of empire, light and fast, pulled by two horses. Chariots served as mobile platforms for archers who could rain arrows while wheeling across the battlefield. To command chariots was a mark of prestige, reserved for the noble-born or the most trusted warriors. Pharaoh himself was often depicted in such a chariot, bow in hand, smiting enemies with divine strength. Life in the army was both harsh and rewarding. Soldiers endured long marches under the burning sun, dusty camps with little comfort, and the constant threat of disease or injury. Yet service also offered chances for wealth and advancement. Campaigns brought plunder. Cattle, gold, slaves, and foreign luxuries flowed into Egypt as the spoils of victory. A successful soldier might return home with riches or earn land as a reward from Pharaoh. For the poor, military service was a ladder dangerous, but one of the few ways to rise. In times of peace, soldiers guarded Egypt's borders, patrolling deserts, watching over caravans, and manning fortresses built of mud brick. Along the Nile, they ensured order, quelling uprisings or guarding officials on their travels. In temples and palaces, elite guards stood as symbols of Pharaoh's might, their presence a reminder that power rested not only in gods and words, but also in spears. But the army was more than men and weapons. It was also a theater of politics. Pharaohs relied on soldiers to enforce their will, but ambitious generals sometimes grew powerful in their own right. Victories could bring fame that rivaled Pharaoh's glory, and in troubled times, military leaders occasionally rose as kingmakers or kings themselves. Thus, while soldiers embodied loyalty, they also carried within them the seeds of challenge to Pharaoh's rule. Yet at its heart, the Egyptian army was tied to Mat, the order that bound gods and men. To defend Egypt was to defend the balance of the world. Enemies were not just foreign powers, but forces of chaos, threatening to unravel the harmony of Nile, sky, and soil. Every battle was in the eyes of the Egyptians, a cosmic struggle. Pharaoh and his soldiers, standing with the gods against the darkness that lurked beyond their borders. At night, in campfires, under the desert stars, soldiers ate bread, dried fish, and drank beer, their songs carrying into the stillness. Some would carve their names into stone or pottery, small marks of their existence on the edges of empire. They were far from the temples, from the rituals of priests, or the comforts of villages. Yet in their loyalty, they carried Egypt itself. When they fell, they were mourned not as mere men, but as guardians of the two lands. Their names might be spoken by comrades, or recorded by scribes if they were fortunate. And in tomb paintings and inscriptions, soldiers marched eternally, spears lifted, defending Egypt in this world and the next. If Pharaoh was the sun, the farmers were the soil. Their lives, humble and often unnoticed, were the foundation of Egypt's greatness. Without their labor, no pyramid would rise, no temple would shine, no army could march, and no court could feast. For it was they who coaxed life from the narrow ribbon of black earth along the Nile, turning its waters into bread, beer, and abundance. The year for a farmer was measured not by months, but by the rhythm of the river. When the Nile rose in its great flood, spilling across fields, the land vanished beneath a sheet of brown water. In that season, farmers could not plow or sow. Instead, they repaired tools, tended animals, or worked on Pharaoh's projects hauling stones, digging canals, laboring in gangs under the watch of overseers. Some cursed the endless toil, others saw it as duty, but all knew it bound them into the larger life of Egypt. When the flood receded, it left behind rich silt, dark and fertile. Then came the season of sowing. Farmers scattered seed by hand while others drove animals across the fields, trampling the grains into the soil. Wooden plows, tipped with bronze or stone, turned the earth. Guided by men whose skin burned under the relentless sun, women and children worked alongside them, carrying water, collecting reeds, or guarding small plots from birds and animals. As the months passed, the green shoots grew into fields of barley and immer wheat. This was Egypt's lifeblood. Bread baked from grain, beer brewed from barley, these were staples that fed peasants, priests, soldiers, and Pharaoh alike. To lose a harvest was to risk famine, so farmers watched the skies anxiously, prayed to Hapi, god of the flood, and left offerings in shrines to ensure the river's generosity. Harvest was a time of both joy and dread. Sickle in hand, farmers cut the stalks. Bundling them into sheaves carried 2 threshing floors. Their oxen trampled the grain free from husk, and workers winnowed it in the wind. Yet the first taste of the harvest was not theirs, it belonged to Pharaoh. Tax collectors arrived, scribes with reed pens and wooden tablets in hand, counting every measure. A share of grain filled royal storehouses, feeding armies and cities, sustaining temples, and ensuring Pharaoh's power. The remainder, whatever was left, fed the farmer's family. A poor harvest meant hunger, debt, or worse, but a good harvest meant survival, perhaps even a small surplus to trade. Their homes were simple mud brick huts, clustered near the fields, shaded by palms. Inside, mats of reed, clay ovens, jars of beer and grains sustained life. Children played in the dust, learning their parents' toil, while elders told stories of gods and ancestors. Life was hard, yet it was steady, rooted in a cycle older than any king. Farmers had little wealth, little voice, and little chance of glory. Yet in festivals, they danced and drank, joining the great rhythm of Egypt's faith. They carried small amulets, prayed for protection in life and after death, and trusted that Math, the balance of the world, would reward even the humblest heart. Some dreamed of more, of serving as a scribe or soldier. But most lived and died in the furrows of the earth, their names forgotten, their work eternal. Pharaohs built their tombs to last forever. Priests sang hymns to preserve the universe. Soldiers carved their names into stone to claim memory. But it was the farmers, bending over their fields, who truly kept Egypt alive. Their hands fed kings and gods alike, though their faces rarely appeared in stone. At dusk, as the sun sank behind the western desert, a farmer stood in his field, watching the light gild the ripples of wheat. He might not have words for empire, for Maat, for the glory of Pharaoh, but he knew that the land was his world, the river his lifeline, the harvest his hope. In his quiet labor lay the strength of Egypt, and so the story of Pharaoh's horizon closes not with kings, nor priests, nor warriors, but with the farmers, the millions of unseen lives who season after season, century after century, built the kingdom grain by grain, harvest by harvest. Their story is Egypt's story, enduring, cyclical, eternal. The Nile's waters glimmered beneath the morning sun. With its rising began another day of labor that would outlast lifetimes. Along the river's edge, barges loaded with limestone blocks drifted down from the quarries of Torah. Men pushed at poles, guiding the rafts through steady currents, their bodies bronzed by the heat and hardened by routine. Each block weighed tons, yet together they moved as if Egypt herself willed them forward. For these stones were destined not for mere walls, but for eternity. On the west bank of the Nile, where the sun set each evening and the land of the dead began, whole villages of workers sprawled in the desert dust. These were not slaves, as later tales would claim, but laborers, farmers conscripted in the off-season, skilled masons, carpenters, rope makers, and overseers. Their homes were small but sturdy, rows of mud brick houses set close together, filled with the chatter of families. Women baked bread in clay ovens, grinding emmer wheat into coarse flour, mixing it with water until the air smelled of yeast and fire. Children ran between doorways, their laughter chasing away the weight of their father's burdens. Each day began at dawn, with overseers shouting men into motion. The rhythm of work was steady, broken by chants that matched the heaving of ropes. Long sledges scraped across the sand, dragging stone blocks toward ramps that grew higher each season as pyramids and temples rose against the horizon. Water was poured along the sand to ease friction, and hundreds of men leaned forward in unison, muscles straining, voices rising in chorus. Songs were as important as ropes. They gave pace, they gave unity, and without them, stone would not move. Those who carved the blocks worked with copper chisels, hammers, and dolerite pounders. Chips of stone flew as sunlight struck against sparks. Dust clung to skin, filled mouths, stung eyes. Yet slowly, with patience that belonged to centuries, Rough stone became smooth, edges aligned, surfaces gleamed. The sound of carving was endless, a heartbeat of the builder's world. Breaks came with food rations distributed from storehouses, loaves of bread, dried fish, onions, beer brewed, thick like porridge. Beer quenched thirst and filled bellies more than water could. Workers joked about their portions, sometimes grumbled when overseers cut rations short, but the meals bound them together in camaraderie. They were not nobles, not priests, yet they carried Egypt's weight on their shoulders, stone by stone. In the workers' village, nights told another story. Fires flickered in courtyards. Men sang of their strength. Women hummed lullabies. Old men told tales of kings long dead. Drums beat softly, and sometimes laughter rose loud enough to echo into the desert. Even in toil, life had music, and joy was carved between exhaustion. Overseers, meanwhile, kept meticulous records. Scribes sat with reed pens and papyrus scrolls, noting each block delivered, each man present, each loaf distributed. The system was precise, for a single missing stone could stall a monument, and Pharaoh's projects allowed no delay. Hieroglyphs in these records survive still lists of workers. Their nicknames, their shifts, their rations are remnants of ordinary men immortalized by their labor. The pyramids and temples they built rose slowly year by year, layer by layer. From a distance, ramps spiraled like serpents around unfinished structures, crawling higher with each passing season. Dust rose in veils, and the desert rang with hammering, chanting the creak of ropes. To stand at the base of such a structure was to feel small against human determination. Yet the workers saw not just Pharaoh's vision, but their own legacy in each block. They knew their children would live in the shade of what they raised. Injuries were common. Stones crushed feet, chisels split skin, the desert sun seared backs. Yet evidence shows workers were cared for, simple splints for broken bones, poultices for wounds, even crude surgeries when necessary. Their labor was grueling, but they were not abandoned. In a way, they were Pharaoh's chosen, bound to his glory by flesh and sweat. Sometimes, when the work slowed and silence fell, a man would lift his gaze. He would see the desert stretching infinite, the river gleaming far below, the half-finished pyramid towering above. Perhaps he thought of the afterlife, of Osiris weighing hearts, of the promise that all souls labored for eternity, just as they did now. Perhaps he wondered if the gods saw him, if his sweat joined with incense in Pharaoh's temples as an offering of its own. By moonlight, the structures looked ghostly, white limestone catching silver glow. Workers resting on mats outside their homes would look up at the glowing pyramid and see more than stone. They saw proof that their toil touched heaven, that Pharaoh's promise of immortality was also theirs, if only through memory. Though their names were rarely carved, though their faces were forgotten, their hands shaped eternity. And in the quiet hours of night, as the desert cooled and stars wheeled above, the builders slept knowing that at dawn the hammers, chants, and ropes would rise again, carrying not just stone, but Egypt's soul. In the villages and towns that lined the Nile, women were the quiet backbone of Egyptian life, their presence woven into every field, every household, every market. Though pharaohs and priests filled inscriptions, it was women who kept the rhythm of daily existence turning like the river's current. At dawn, when the first light stretched across mud brick homes, women were already awake. They ground immer wheat on flat stone querns, the rasping sound carrying through courtyards. Kneeling for hours, they turned grain into flour, mixing it with water, before baking flat loaves in clay ovens. The smell of bread was as constant in Egypt as the Nile itself. Alongside bread, beer was brewed daily. Women soaked grain until it sprouted, mashed it into thick paste. left it to ferment with dates or herbs, and strained the froth into clay jars. The brew was thick, nourishing, and far safer than river water, making it a staple for both children and adults. Brewing was not only a household task, but a craft women who mastered it could sell their beer in markets, earning coin or trade in return. Markets themselves were alive with women's voices. They sold vegetables, dried fish, woven linens, and amulets carved from faience. Husbands might work in fields or workshops, but women ensured goods circulated, feeding communities with both food and commerce. Their stalls hummed with bargaining, gossip, and laughter, as familiar as the hum of cicadas in summer. Within households, women managed the flow of daily life. They raised children, tended animals, spun flax into linen, and wove cloth on looms that clacked steadily through the day. Spinning and weaving were considered almost sacred gifts of Neith, the goddess of creation and war, who was herself depicted weaving the world into being. Each thread pulled across the loom was part of a tradition that stretched back generations. Marriage in Egypt was less ceremonial than one might imagine. There were no grand temple rites for ordinary people, but agreements between families, contracts of property, and the simple act of moving into a shared household. Women had more rights here than in many ancient lands. They could own property, inherit land, divorce husbands, and raise legal cases in court. Papyrus contracts survive, showing women lending money, selling goods, even managing estates. Though power was still unequal, their agency was unmistakable. In the fields, women labored alongside men during harvest, gathering sheaves of barley, binding stalks, carrying baskets to threshing floors. Children trailed behind, their small hands learning to pick grain, their laughter mingling with the rustle of crops. These shared labors tied families together, the harvest a festival of sweat and song. Each family ensuring none went hungry when the river's bounty waned. Fertility and motherhood were sacred roles. Women wore amulets of Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, or Base, the squat, smiling god who warded off evil. Figurines placed in homes showed pregnant women reminders of life's fragility and its sanctity. Childbirth was dangerous, yet surrounded with ritual chants, incense. Protective spells whispered against the forces that might harm mother or child. Children who survived grew into a world where their mothers' voices shaped them more than Pharaoh's decrees. These stories were told by firelight, lullabies hummed against the hum of crickets, lessons in patience, kindness, and strength woven into daily chores. Mothers and grandmothers preserved the wisdom of herbs, healing cuts with honey, easing fevers with willow bark, soothing coughs with figs boiled in water. Women's influence reached into religion too. In great temples, priestesses served Hathor, goddess of love and music, or Isis, the mother who wept for Osiris. They shook sistrums during rituals, their music calling joy into the halls of gods. Hymns written in women's voices survive, songs of devotion that blend love with faith, sensuality with holiness. Some noble women even rose to extraordinary power. The title, God's Wife of Ammon, became one of the most prestigious in Thebes, granting its holder wealth and political sway to rival governors. These women, cloaked in linen and crowned with divine symbols, were bridges between earthly life and eternity. Queens, too, carved their mark. From the powerful Hatshepsut, who ruled as Pharaoh, to Nefertiti, who shone beside Akhenaten, Egypt saw women step into the sunlit throne itself. Their reigns were rare, yet they stood as reminders that Egypt's order allowed for balance, for the feminine as much as the masculine. Yet most women lives unseen by scrolls or stone. Their immortality rested not in monuments, but in memory children who carried their names. Husbands who leaned on their labor, villages that thrived because of their unrecorded work. They did not carve pyramids or march with armies, but without them, bread would not rise. Linen would not clothe, families would not endure, As evening fell, women gathered with neighbors, talking under fading light, their hands still busy with spinning or preparing the next day's dough. Stars blinked overhead. The river whispered in the dark, and the sound of mothers soothing children to sleep carried softly across courtyards. In those small gestures lay Egypt's endurance. For though pharaohs claimed eternity with stone and priests renewed the world with chants, it was women at hearth and loom, at market and cradle, who kept Egypt alive day after day, generation after generation. If temples were the beating heart of Egypt's spirit, the army was its shield and spear. Though Egyptians loved order and peace, they lived in a world where deserts, raiders, and rival kingdoms pressed against their borders. The Pharaoh's army was not only a tool of defense, but also a symbol of divine strength, proving that the gods had chosen him to protect the land of the Nile. In Egypt's earliest days, soldiers were little more than peasants called from their villages when danger came. They fought with stone maces, wooden clubs, and shields of cowhide stretched across wooden frames. But as centuries passed, warfare became an art as carefully maintained as temple ritual. By the time of the New Kingdom, the army was professional, organized into divisions of thousands, each carrying the names of gods like Amun, Ra, or Ptah. To march in their ranks was to fight not only for Pharaoh, but under divine protection. Training began young. Boys of soldiering families learned to run long distances across desert sands, to hurl javelins, to fire arrows with speed and accuracy. Wrestling was common, teaching both strength and balance. For Egyptians, the body was a weapon as much as the spear, and a soldier's endurance was tested under the relentless sun. When Pharaoh called, men were ready to march for weeks with only dried rations and the cool water carried in clay jars on donkeys' backs. Weapons were simple yet deadly. The spear, with bronze or later iron tips, was the backbone of the infantry. Bows made of wood and sinew launched arrows tipped with flint, bronze, or obsidian. Curved swords called koppish gleamed in battle, part axe, part sickle, designed to hook shields or slash through armor. Shields grew taller and broader, painted with bright colors or the symbols of gods. Each piece of gear told a story, of a land learning to adapt, of a people determined to hold their river valley safe from chaos. Perhaps the most fearsome weapon of Egypt was not the sword or spear, but the chariot. Introduced by the Hyksos invaders, the two-wheeled chariot became a symbol of royal power and battlefield dominance. Light, fast, and drawn by two horses, it carried an archer who could rain arrows while racing across the sands. Pharaohs themselves rode into battle in golden chariots, their presence shining like the sun god Ra descending into war. Reliefs carved in temples show them larger than life, bow drawn, enemies scattering before their might. But the army was more than battles. Soldiers built roads, canals, and fortresses that dotted Egypt's frontiers. Along the Nile Delta, strongholds rose against Libyan raiders. To the south, forts watched Nubia, guarding trade routes that brought gold, ivory, and exotic animals. These garrisons were small worlds of their own, walls of mud brick, barracks for soldiers, storehouses packed with grain and arrows, and watchtowers that scanned the horizon for threats. Life in a garrison was long stretches of boredom, broken by sudden bursts of danger. Egyptian campaigns often went beyond defense. Pharaohs sought glory in Canaan, in Nubia, in Syria. Conquest meant wealth. Captives became slaves. Foreign lands sent tribute of silver, timber, and cattle. Each victory was carved on temple walls. Where Pharaoh was shown smiting enemies beneath his raised mace, the gods approving above, soldiers shared in the spoils too, rewarded with jewelry, land, or slaves. For many peasants, military service was one of the few paths to rise above poverty, to trade the plow for honor and riches. Yet war also carried hardship. Soldiers marched far from home, sometimes for years, leaving families to tend fields alone. Letters. Survive where wives begged for grain, where children asked when their fathers would return. Not every man came back. Those who did carried scars of wounds of exhaustion, battles fought under burning sun, or in lands where rains and strange tongues filled the air. Religion and war were never separate. Before a campaign, priests performed rituals asking the gods to march beside Pharaoh's armies. Standards topped with sacred emblems, falcons, bulls, jackals, led divisions into battle, reminders that each regiment fought under a divine eye. Even in death, soldiers were honored with burials, sometimes with weapons placed at their sides. Their service marking them as protectors in this life and the next. At the top of this martial world stood the Pharaoh, commander of commanders, mighty bull, who smashes foreign lands. His victories were not only political, but cosmic, proof that he upheld Maat by pushing back the forces of chaos embodied by foreign enemies. The army was his arm, the priests his voice, together ensuring Egypt remained eternal. Still, the army was also human. Veterans told stories around fires of raids gone wrong, of the sound of arrows like buzzing bees, of comrades who fell beside them. They drank beer, laughed, boasted, and remembered. And in villages along the Nile, their families waited watching the horizon for the first sign of their return, praying to gods and ancestors alike for safe passage home. Thus, the army was more than war. It was toil and hope, sacrifice and ambition. It carried Egypt's borders outward and held them firm, carved Pharaoh's glory into stone, and bound soldier to farmer, god to king, Nile to desert. Without it, the temples would have stood unguarded, the granaries plundered, the land exposed. With it, Egypt endured, its shield raised against the endless tides of history. Life in ancient Egypt began at the edge of the Nile, where the cries of newborns joined the rhythm of a river that never ceased to flow. Children were considered blessings of the gods, symbols of hope and renewal. Families, whether rich or poor, treasured them, for they carried the line of ancestors forward and promised offerings to the dead in generations yet to come. Childhood, however, was both tender and fragile in a land where disease, accident, and hardship could cut life short. Infant mortality was high, and mothers relied on charms and prayers to protect their little ones. Amulets shaped like the goddess Toret, a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, or the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, were hung around a child's neck to guard against sickness and evil spirits. Mothers nursed their babies for 3 or 4 years, a practice that both nourished and shielded them from illness. In the soft mud brick houses of villages, children toddled barefoot across floors, their heads shaved except for a single side lock of hair, the side lock of youth which marked them as not yet grown. Games and play filled their early years. Little girls spun with clay dolls, some with wigs of string or movable limbs. Boys chased hoops, rolled marbles of polished stone, or wrestled in the dust. Boys carved from wood a lion with wheels. A crocodile with snapping jaws showed that even in the most ancient times, laughter and amusement were part of growing up. Songs and lullabies were passed from mother to child, their rhythms as old as the Nile's current. But childhood was also a time of learning. For most children, this meant imitating their parents. Sons of farmers followed fathers to the fields, watching how to guide plows pulled by oxen, how to dig irrigation ditches, how to sow and harvest in rhythm with the flood. Daughters shadowed mothers, learning to grind grain, bake bread, weave linen, and carried jars of water balanced on their heads. Skills were passed hand to hand, generation to generation, in an endless chain of survival. For the children of nobles, scribes, or priests, education took a different form. Schools often attached to temples or government offices taught boys to read and write, but Papyrus scrolls, ink palettes of black and red, and wooden writing boards were their tools. The lessons were strict, with discipline enforced by stern teachers who believed a boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten. Copying texts was the heart of learning, from hymns to gods to wisdom literature. A child who mastered hieroglyphs or the simpler hieratic script could rise far. 4 scribes were the backbone of Egypt's bureaucracy. Girls rarely attended formal schools, but daughters of elite families still learned to read and write at home. More often, they were trained in managing households, in music, and in the rituals of religion. Some became priestesses, musicians, or dancers in temples, their roles both respected and influential. Childhood, in this sense, was preparation for adult responsibilities, shaped by one's station in life. Religion shadowed children from the start. They joined festivals, carried lotus flowers, sang hymns, and watched the barks of gods sail down the Nile during celebrations. When ill, they were brought to healers who combined practical medicine with prayers and incantations. In tomb paintings, children are shown naked or nearly so, with the sidelock of youth often clutching lotus blossoms, a symbol of rebirth. To the Egyptians, children were not only part of the living world, but also reminders of eternity. Discipline and affection coexisted. Texts reveal fathers urging sons to study, warning against idleness. Yet family scenes in art show tenderness, mothers holding children close, siblings playing, fathers placing a protective hand on a small shoulder. The bond of kinship was deep. To lose a child was a grief that even time could not erase. Amulets, prayers, and rituals all spoke of a society desperately trying to shield its youngest from the fragility of life. Children grew older, their paths diverged. Boys of common families entered fields, workshops, or the army by their teens. Some apprenticed as carpenters, potters, or fishermen, their hands toughened by labor. Sons of scribes inherited posts, while noble youths prepared for priesthood or administration. Girls married young, often by their early teens, taking on the roles of wife and mother that anchored Egyptian households. Still, moments of freedom remained. Children splashed in the Nile, their laughter echoing as they swam beside fishing boats. They played chasing games in village lanes, sang songs with clapping rhythms, or hunted birds with slings. These fragments of joy bridged the gap between the innocence of childhood and the demands of adult life waiting just beyond. In tombs and inscriptions, parents prayed that their children would continue the cycle of offerings after death. To the Egyptians, a child was more than a joy in life. They were the link to eternity. The ones who would speak a parent's name at the offering table, keeping the soul alive. Childhood, therefore, was not only preparation for life, but for the duties of death. Thus, childhood in ancient Egypt was a mixture of tenderness and necessity. It was protected by amulets and songs, shaped by work and learning, brightened by games and laughter, yet shadowed by fragility. Whether noble or farmer's child, each began at the same point, beneath the endless sun of the Nile, within families that hoped, prayed, and worked to see them grow into the next keepers of the land. As the sun rose each day over the Nile, life in ancient Egypt unfolded in a rhythm that bound together the great and the humble, the seen and the unseen, the earthly and the divine. It was a civilization sustained not only by its mighty river, but by a shared belief that the universe itself was fragile, forever needing the hands of men and women to maintain balance, order, and continuity. To live in Egypt was to live under the gaze of gods and ancestors, to walk in harmony with the eternal principle of truth, balance, and justice. At the heart of this world stood the Pharaoh, the living embodiment of divine order. Crowned with the twin symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, he was more than a king. He was the axis around which heaven and earth revolved. His image was carved into colossal statues, towering over temple courts, reminding all who gazed upon them that he was both man and God. Yet the Pharaoh was not alone in this burden. His authority was woven together with the power of priests, generals, and scribes, each one a thread in the fabric that sustained the kingdom. The priests guarded the hidden life of the gods. At dawn, their chants and offerings brought the sun back into the sky, ensuring that Ra's journey across the heavens would continue. They bathed statues, anointed them with oils, and placed food before them, not because the gods ate, but because the rituals preserved the balance of the cosmos. For ordinary people, these mysteries were distant, glimpsed only during festivals when the doors of the sanctuary opened and the god's statue was carried out to the sound of sistrums, drums, and cheers from the crowd. The temple was both the house of the divine and the beating heart of Egypt's economy. With estates, fields, and workshops sustaining its daily needs, beside the sacred world, there was the world of survival. Farmers rose before dawn, their lives bound to the Nile's flood. When the river swelled and spread its waters across the floodplain, they rejoiced, for silt-rich soil promised abundant crops. When the flood failed, famine stalked the land. The cycle of planting and harvest, plowing and reaping, was both exhausting and sacred. To farm the Nile was to participate in creation itself, renewing what the gods had once shaped from chaos. Craftsmen, too, carried Egypt's identity into eternity. Stone carvers etched hieroglyphs into tomb walls. Painters filled them with vibrant colors that still dazzle thousands of years later. Potters turned clay into vessels for daily use, while weavers spun linen fine enough to rival silk. Their work was practical but also eternal, for much of it was destined for tombs and temples, where it would accompany the dead into the afterlife, or honor gods who never aged. Each object was a testament to skill, faith, and the human desire for permanence. Children played among these rhythms, chasing hoops, swimming in the river, or imitating their parents' tasks. Their sidelocks of youth marked them as innocent, but their lives were brief apprenticeships for adulthood. Boys watched fathers in the fields or workshops. Daughters learned from mothers the skills that sustained the household. Some, the fortunate few, entered schools to become scribes, mastering the arts of writing that gave them power beyond their years. For all, childhood was fleeting, for responsibility waited just beyond. Yet life was not only work and ritual. Festivals brought joy and release. The Nile Festival celebrated the river's rising. The Opet Festival saw gods carried in procession, their barks drifting along the waters as music and feasting filled the air. People danced, sang, and drank beer brewed from barley, laughing in the shadows of temples. In those moments, the divine touched every villager, every noble, every farmer, weaving together the high and the low in shared celebration. And when life ended, death began another journey. Tombs carved into cliffs or built as pyramids stood as bridges to eternity. Families gathered to mourn, priests recited prayers, and amulets were placed among wrappings to guard the soul. The journey to the afterlife was long and perilous, filled with trials and judgment. But the promise of paradise, the field of reeds, waited for those who had lived in harmony with Ma. To an Egyptian, death was not an ending, but a continuation, another step in the eternal rhythm. From Pharaoh in his palace to the farmer in his mud brick home, from the high priest in a temple court to the child playing in the dust, every Egyptian shared in this cycle. Their lives were short compared to the monuments they built, but their faith and labor created a civilization that endured for over 3 millennia, longer than any other in human history. What survives today, pyramids rising above the desert, Hieroglyphs cut deep into stone, painted tombs still glowing with color is only a fragment of that vast world. Behind those ruins once lived millions of ordinary people. Mothers grinding grain, children splashing in the Nile, soldiers marching in desert heat, priests whispering prayers in torchlit sanctuaries. Each life, however small, was part of the great whole. The story of ancient Egypt, then, is not only about kings and monuments, but about a people who lived in rhythm with their river, their gods, and their ancestors. It is about their struggle against chaos, their search for meaning, their hope that in the eternal order of the universe, their names and deeds would never be forgotten. And in a way they succeeded. Thousands of years later, we still speak their names, read their words, and marvel at the world they built along the Nile. In that sense, priests were right. Through memory and story, the dead live on, and the cycle continues, as enduring as the river itself.